They thought they were just being resettled, promised safety, shelter, and a chance to start over. The trains rattled through the cold wind, filled with families holding babies, old people clutching prayer books, children asking when they would arrive. They had suitcases with them. Some even packed their nicest clothes, photos, wedding rings, and small pieces of home. But as the train doors slid open at Birkenau, everything changed. There were no homes, no new beginnings, only the smell of burning flesh in the air, towers, barbed wire, barking dogs, men in uniforms shouting orders in languages they didn't understand. The ground was wet from melted snow and ash, and the wind carried something darker than the cold. It carried the smell of death. Some looked around, confused. Others knew immediately. Mothers held their children closer. Old men looked toward the smokestacks with silent horror. Some whispered prayers. Some went silent forever. In that exact moment, Birkenau stopped being just a place. It became a monster, a machine designed not to imprison, but to erase. A place where time didn't move forward. Only life moved towards end. The people who entered here did not simply die. They vanished, burned into smoke, scattered into ash, dissolved into mud beneath the watchtowers. And yet, their voices didn't disappear. They float in the cold wind over these abandoned tracks, whispering the same haunting question: how could humans do this to other humans? Tonight, we walk through that question, through the snow, through the barbed wire, beyond the silence, and into Birkenau, the heart of the Holocaust, where the world's darkest truth was built, brick by brick, body by body, soul by soul. Stay with me. Don't look away. Because this story isn't just history, it's a warning. Chapter 1. The Blueprint of Genocide. Birkenau's Conception. The wind over occupied Poland in the summer of 1941 did not carry the smell of death just yet. It smelled of damp soil, cut grass, and something else, anticipation, maybe. Swarms of German officials moved across a small Polish village called Brzezinka, holding blueprints, measuring tapes, and leather-bound documents. They were not soldiers. They were architects, engineers, and planners. Men with pens instead of rifles. But what they were about to build would kill more people than any weapon in human history. Men spoke in calm, professional tones, as if they were designing a school or a factory. But it was something very different. They spoke of capacity, expansion, rail access, and efficiency. They were preparing to build a machine. A silent, efficient machine, designed not for work but for death. 2 months earlier, in June 1941, Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler had issued a chilling order. He wanted a new camp, an expansion of Auschwitz, but not just any camp. It had to be bigger, much bigger, capable of holding 200,000 Soviet prisoners of war. And it had to be close to existing rail lines for the smooth unloading of human cargo. He spoke about it with the same logic and cold precision a factory manager uses while discussing production targets. Except this factory would not produce goods. It would eliminate people. A new kind of camp was needed for a new kind of war. One where victory did not just mean conquering land. It meant erasing entire populations. The German architects first walked through the fields of Brzezinka in muddy boots, stepping through long grass, puddles, and abandoned farmhouses. The land looked peaceful, a quiet farming village, tree-lined and postcard-like. But what these men saw in it was not tranquility. They saw potential. It was flat, open, accessible, and close to railway junctions. It was perfect, 20 kilometers from Krakow, with direct railway connections across Europe, and close enough to Auschwitz to be managed, but far enough to be separate, hidden. They looked at the soil and saw future foundations. They looked at the horizon and saw watchtowers. Karl Bischoff, a skilled architect and engineer, was soon appointed chief builder. He read Himmler's orders and began sketching. Not homes, not barracks, not factories. Something else, something sinister, though he never wrote that word. He thought in terms of transport, reception, storage, and disposal. A process with steps, regulated, documented, mathematically managed. Birkenau would be built not as a prison, not as a camp, but as the heart of an extermination system. He did not yet design gas chambers. They didn't call them that. They used vague terms like special installations and new facilities. But the intention was clear to those who needed to know. Nothing in Birkenau was accidental. Every detail was planned. Rail access was not just convenient. It was critical. The main railway from Hungary, France, Slovakia, Belgium, Greece, Italy, and even Norway could eventually connect here. Deportation trains could roll straight into the camp, cutting down transport time, eliminating logistical problems. No delays, no escape opportunities. By designing Birkenau around railway geometry, it became a funnel, a one-way path. Arrival, selection, extermination. It was not just a camp. It was a flowchart of death. Orders were given to local Polish workers to vacate homes. Barns were emptied. Trees were marked for cutting. The first prisoners, mostly Polish and Jewish inmates from the original Auschwitz, were marched in to begin construction in late 1941. The land was swampy, filled with puddles, mud, and mosquitoes. Every step was heavy. Men collapsed under loads of bricks and timber. There were no machines, no cranes, no protective clothing. Prisoners dug foundations with bare hands, using rotting shovels and half-broken carts. Those who fell died. Those who continued built. People were dying even before the camp existed. The original intention was to build a large barrack-style labor camp. But something changed. Slowly, quietly, a transformation began. This expansion of Auschwitz would not simply hold workers. It would receive entire populations. This was no temporary measure for controlling prisoners. This was the physical execution of a new concept, total eradication. And at the center of this plan was a chillingly simple calculation. A prisoner can be forced to work, fed the bare minimum, and eventually die. But that takes time. Weeks, maybe months. And time was something the Nazis did not want to waste. They needed something faster, more efficient, a direct method. The architects of Birkenau were not building to contain life. They were building to process death. It was around this time that dark whispers began to circulate among engineers and officers. The architects discussed shower rooms with no drains, sealed windows, concrete walls 3 times thicker than normal, and locked doors that opened only from the outside. It was clear these were not meant for living. These were meant for dying. Birkenau was divided into sectors, BI for men, BII for women, and later BII, the so-called Mexico section, planned but never completed. But these sectors were not simply housing zones. They were part of a system. Prisoners would arrive, be sorted, worked, or more often, not worked, and removed. It was not a prison complex. It was a terminal. Himmler visited the site in early 1942. He observed the muddy grounds, the half-built barracks, the exhausted workers. He did not see suffering. He saw potential. He approved expansions that doubled, then tripled, then quadrupled the planned capacity. He ordered new facilities, although never openly calling them what they truly were. The language was carefully disguised. Construction documents contained words like disinfection installations, delousing centers, bathhouses. But everyone involved knew what those words really meant. Karl Bischoff revised the plans. The new camp would not just have living quarters. It would have reception ramps, sorting zones, incinerators, and new sealed underground chambers that resembled morgues. Officially, they were morgues. In reality, they were designed to kill. By early 1942, the land that had once been peaceful farmland had become a skeleton of wooden frames, lines of barbed wire, and half-built barracks. Chimneys rose where trees once stood. A railway spur was drawn on paper, showing how trains would enter directly into Birkenau. The diagrams looked like lines, blocks, and arrows. But in reality, they showed human movement, crowds, confusion, separation. Arrows pointing one way to life, arrows pointing the other way to death. The climate was unforgiving. Snow melted into mud. Winds cut through half-finished barracks. Prisoners, Polish, Jewish, Soviet, were pushed to work under gunpoint, without coats, without boots, without hope. But they built. As they built, they wondered, why did a camp need so many chimneys? Why were the walls so thick? Why were they building underground rooms with reinforced ceilings? No one told them, but some began to suspect. And yet, no one, not even the prisoners working, could truly imagine the scale of what this place was becoming. Not just a camp, not just a prison, not just a site of murder, but the center of something new in human history, the industrialization of death. Birkenau would become the main station in a network of genocide, the heart of the Holocaust. By the end of 1941, the foundations had been laid, not just in bricks and concrete, but in intention. Himmler's order was no longer just a command. It was a reality. Birkenau was growing, and with every barack, every fence, every railway track, it drew closer to its purpose. And deep in the mud, beneath every post and every plank, lay the truth. A camp designed not to imprison, but to erase. And then, in early 1942, something happened that changed everything. A decision was made. A test would occur. A new substance would be tried. A new method, faster than starvation, more silent than bullets. And with that test, Birkenau would officially become something it had never been before. A killing center. The blueprint was complete. But the real construction was only just beginning. Chapter 2. Building Death. Forced labor and the birth of Birkenau. The first thing they noticed was the mud. Thick, freezing, clinging to their feet like it wanted to swallow them whole. The prisoners arrived in staggered groups, escorted by SS guards and barking dogs, stumbling across swampy fields that stretched as far as they could see. Snow mixed with rain turned the ground into a cold black swamp. Every step sank. Every breath burned. The air smelled of rotting wood, wet soil, and fear. They had no idea that they were not just building a camp. They were building the largest killing factory the world had ever seen. And no one had warned them that death, for many of them, would begin long before the gas chambers. These prisoners were the very first to walk into what would become Birkenau. They were mostly Polish political prisoners, local Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, and eventually transports from across occupied Europe. They were not brought here to live. They were brought here to build. They carried hammers, picks, crowbars, and shovels that were too dull to be useful. They were given no gloves, no boots, no warm coats, only striped uniforms, thin as paper. But still, the SS shouted, "Work faster, faster," as if the mud, hunger, and wind were not already weapons. At first, it looked like simple construction. Piles of timber, bricks stacked beside muddy trenches, wooden beams laid on the wet ground. But there was something deeply wrong. Normal construction sites have tools, designs, and safety. Here, they had none of that. The SS stood beside them, gripping rifles instead of blueprints. Guards did not discuss architecture. They discussed efficiency of labor. And efficiency meant pushing human bodies to the limit until they broke. One prisoner later wrote, "The ground was like quicksand. If you stood for 3 seconds, you sank." Yet they worked. They built the first fences. They drove posts into frozen earth until their palms split open. The wire went up, multiple rows of barbed wire, then electric fencing. Watchtowers followed, built with logs they dragged by hand. Every structure was made with blood. Every fence post, every nail. The camp began taking shape sector by sector. The first section was BIA, meant for male prisoners. Then BIB. The SS called it expansion, but it was more like a growing disease, spreading rapidly across the fields. The architects back in Berlin looked at progress reports, seeing numbers, 200 barracks planned, 30 completed, 40 in preparation. They saw success. They did not see the prisoners collapsing in mud, their skin turning blue, their boots torn, and their bodies trembling from hunger. Auschwitz Commandant Rudolf Haas inspected constantly. In his polished boots and black SS coat, he walked the perimeter, sometimes stepping over fallen workers as if they were broken tools. He wanted orders to be followed precisely. Foundations had to be deep. Barracks had to be identical. He insisted. The camp must look orderly, even if the workers building it were dying with no order at all. Birkenau was designed to hold 200,000 people at one point, but there was no intention to truly house them. These weren't living quarters. They were storage units. Human storage. Prisoners constructed long wooden barracks, originally meant for horses, but now fitted with triple bunks. A space meant for 50 animals would eventually hold almost 700 human beings. No insulation, no heating, no proper ventilation. Just wood, straw, lice, and despair. One morning, in late 1941, the first Soviet prisoners, a convoy of exhausted, starving soldiers, arrived, dragging their feet through sludge. They were broken, sick, and barely alive. They had marched for days without food. For a moment, prisoners already working there looked at them with pity. Then, they watched them die. Most of those Soviet prisoners would never live to see the camp completed. More than half froze, starved, or collapsed from exhaustion within weeks. Yet, in the eyes of the SS, their job was done. They helped build Birkenau. Every day, new structures rose: barracks, latrines, kitchens, storehouses. But the most important buildings, the ones hidden behind deceptively simple names like bunker, sauna, or Canada, the warehouse area, were not ordinary facilities. Deception was stitched into the language. Nothing was called what it truly was. Bunkers were gas chambers. Saunas were selection rooms. Canada was where stolen belongings were sorted. And what looked like warehouses were processing centers for human lives. As the camp expanded, so did the system around it. Work details were formed, platoon-like groups of prisoners forced to shovel mud, carry bricks, drag planks, or dig drainage canals with bare hands. The SS referred to these forced labor teams as construction brigades, but they were closer to living funerals. Whoever entered those brigades rarely came back. The biting Polish winter struck hard at the end of 1941. Prisoners woke up every morning shivering uncontrollably, their breath turning to frost, their thin uniforms stiff with ice. Some prisoners froze to death in their sleep. Others died standing, collapsing face first in mud or snow. Guards did not flinch. They replaced the dead with more workers, more prisoners, more bodies to move soil, more bodies to build defenses that would later confine their replacements. The SS had a rule. Prisoners who collapsed and could not rise within 10 seconds were beaten. Those who failed within 20 seconds were dragged aside and shot or left to freeze. Efficiency again. Work must continue. The walls must go up. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the highest-ranking officials reviewed progress. The camp was not expanding fast enough. They needed more workers, and more workers meant more prisoners. Orders were sent to accelerate construction, increase capacity, and improve rail access. Auschwitz-Birkenau would soon need a direct railway spur, one that entered the camp itself. The plans were drawn, tracks leading directly into Birkenau, stopping just meters from where selections and exterminations would take place. By early 1942, the transformation was undeniable. What had been a labor camp construction site was now something different. It was becoming a processing center. Birkenau's location, size, and structure were being shaped for one thing: mass extermination. Still, the prisoners building all this did not fully understand what they were creating. They guessed. They heard rumors. They noticed strange design features: thick-walled structures, sealed windows, locked rooms, heavy door bolts. But they did not know that soon these walls would hold poison, and that the new chimneys would not be for warmth. Then came bunkers 1 and 2, the first real killing facilities at Birkenau. They didn't look like factories of death. They looked like simple brick farmhouses surrounded by trees. But inside, the walls had been sealed, doors reinforced, square openings carved at the top. Those openings would soon be used to drop cyanide pellets, Zyklon B, into the rooms below, killing not with fire, but with gas. Prisoners who worked nearby began to whisper among themselves. Why were families entering those buildings, but never coming out? Why were carts full of shoes, bags, and clothing taken away afterward? Why did black smoke rise up from behind the woods? Birkenau was changing. They could feel it. Meanwhile, construction continued. Between 1942 and 1943, Birkenau grew from wooden skeletons into a fully operating complex. Black wires went up. Watchtowers extended across the horizon. Floodlights were added. The electric fences were switched on, charged with enough voltage to kill instantly. Prisoners heard the hum of electricity running through the barbed wire like a pulse. They called it the singing fence. Thousands would later choose to die on it, pressing themselves against it to escape the slow death that awaited them. But not yet. For now, Birkenau was still being built, and more workers were needed. More men, more women, more children, soon to be used as tools, then discarded. The sick irony was brutal. The Holocaust's greatest killing center was built not by soldiers or machines, but by prisoners who would become its first victims. They built their own cages. They hammered the doors to their own execution rooms. They dug the foundations for the very barracks in which they would later freeze, starve, or be selected for death. One prisoner later wrote, "We did not build houses. We built graves. We just did not know it yet." By mid-1942, Birkenau had taken shape. Sector BI was nearly full. Sector BII was under construction. The foundations for Sector BI were being surveyed. New water channels, new brick barracks, new firing posts, and most importantly, new transport ramps. The SS officers smiled as they looked at the railway design. Soon, trains would not stop outside Auschwitz. They would drive straight into Birkenau. More efficient, more controlled, more deadly. At last, the architect's vision was coming alive. A system, a process, not random killings, but industrial genocide. A place where death would become a routine, recorded on paper, counted, tallied, and filed away like inventory. And then, sometime in the late winter of 1942, the truth finally revealed itself to those still building. One morning, they saw a large group of women and children walk past their work area, heading toward Bunker 2. They were calm, holding hands. Some even smiled, believing the lie they had been told, that they would receive a shower, food, and rest. An hour later, trucks came out, filled not with people, but with bodies. That day, Birkenau stepped through an invisible door. It ceased to be a construction site. It had become what it was always intended to be, a killing center. And as the snow melted and spring arrived, the fields of Birkenau did not turn green. They turned gray, gray with ash. And the work was not finished, because soon, something far bigger would arrive, the trains. And Birkenau was ready for them. Chapter 3, From Camp to Killing Center, the shift toward mass extermination. The winter of 1942 was bitterly cold, but what froze the soul of Birkenau was not the weather. It was the silence, a silence that followed the first experimental mass killings. It wasn't the normal silence of exhaustion or fear. It was something deeper, a silence that felt heavy, unnatural, like the air itself held its breath. Prisoners didn't talk about it, but they all felt it. They no longer believed they were building just a camp. Someone whispered late at night, under flea-infested blankets, "This place is for death." And quietly, no one argued. In Berlin, the most powerful men in the Nazi regime were preparing something enormous, something that would change Birkenau forever. They gathered not in muddy fields, but in warm, polished rooms, under chandeliers, sipping tea while discussing extermination. This meeting would not happen in Birkenau, or even in Auschwitz, but in a villa by a frozen lake in the suburbs of Berlin. On January 20th, 1942, 15 high-ranking officials, including Reinhard Heydrich, Adolf Eichmann, and representatives of the SS, ministries, and occupied territories, met at Wannsee. They did not discuss war strategy. They did not talk about tactical losses or divisions or troop movements. They discussed the final solution to the Jewish question. In simple terms, how to eliminate 11 million Jews from Europe, efficiently, secretly, and permanently. That meeting was where the machine truly began. And Birkenau, standing silent and half-built in the snow, was about to become its beating heart. By the time news of Wannsee reached Auschwitz Command, Birkenau was already functioning, but not at full capacity. The farmhouses known as Bunker 1 and Bunker 2 had been converted into crude killing facilities. They were just ordinary cottages, their windows shuttered, their interiors sealed, their doors reinforced. They held no official markings, no signs, just hollow silence. They were referred to as the Little Red House and the Little White House because of their brick and plaster walls. But those who saw what happened inside them never called them by those names again. They called them something else, the houses of no return. The first gassings of Birkenau were experimental. Not a large-scale system yet, but something raw, improvised. Zyklon B, cyanide pellets designed as insecticide, was used. It had already been tested in Auschwitz on Soviet prisoners the year before. But at Birkenau, it would be used differently. Not only on hundreds, not only on thousands, but eventually on hundreds of thousands. The SS officers performing the early killings were nervous. They wore gas masks. They shouted instructions. They waited. And then, they opened the doors. The silence afterward was unbearable. Word began to spread, slowly. A guard spilled something drunk. An SS medic talked too much. A Sonderkommando prisoner whispered about what he had seen, about people being told they would get showers, only to enter a building from which they never emerged. Some prisoners didn't believe it. Their minds refused to imagine it. But deep down, they knew something monstrous had begun. The SS wasn't satisfied with those early gassing facilities. They were too small, too primitive, too slow. This was not efficient enough. What they needed was a system, a true extermination facility. And it had to be built in Birkenau, because Birkenau had space. Birkenau had railway access. Birkenau was far from prying eyes. That was when new teams of architects, engineers, and construction experts, led by SS Sturmbannführer Karl Bischoff, arrived at Birkenau carrying new blueprints. These weren't blueprints for barracks. These were blueprints for crematoria, and not just one, 4 of them, each fitted with underground, undressing rooms, antechambers, gas chambers disguised with fake shower heads, and a furnace system that could burn bodies day and night. Not primitive farmhouses, not temporary solutions, but permanent structures, industrial death factories. The design was chilling. Victims would enter the building through a door at ground level, thinking they were heading to showers. They would be sent downstairs into the basement. They would undress, handing over their belongings. They would walk calmly into a chamber, sealed, airtight, with steel doors and vents on the ceiling through which Zyklon B could be dropped. After 20 minutes, the gas would clear. The Sonderkommando would enter wearing masks, dragging out bodies, removing valuables, hair, dental gold, and then load them into the cremation furnaces above. One building could burn more than 1,000 corpses in a single day. 4 buildings could handle more than 5,000. With open-air pits, even more. A death factory. Prisoners watched construction begin. They dragged heavy pipes, iron beams, and concrete slabs across frozen mud. They stacked bricks, hammered, and paved surfaces. They thought they were building warehouses, workshops, bathhouses. The SS used words like disinfection, special treatment, recovery chambers. No one dared question, but they suspected. Rumors had turned into truth. They sensed the meaning behind the lies. The SS increased secrecy. Prisoners working closest to the new buildings were isolated. Sonderkommando prisoners, Jewish men forced to handle corpses, were never allowed to return to regular camp areas. Anyone who got too close to the new facilities was shot or transferred. The buildings were surrounded by trees, camouflaged under tarps, and referred to as delousing installations. But even that name soon changed. They were simply called the installations, as if death itself had become a technical procedure. By late spring 1942, the first complete extermination process took place entirely at Birkenau. A transport arrived. Prisoners were selected on the ramp, men to one side, women and children to the other. No records were taken for most of them. They weren't registered. They weren't counted. They were sent straight to Bunker 2, told to undress and disappear. Forever. It was at this moment that Birkenau stopped pretending. It was no longer a labor camp. It was no longer a camp at all. It had become something else. A place designed to make people vanish. That summer, the killings increased. Train lines extended. More barbed wire. More barracks. More watchtowers. Every expansion brought more death. Birkenau became a hub, a processing center, not just for prisoners from Poland, but from all over Europe. France, Belgium, Slovakia, Holland, Germany, Austria, Croatia, Italy. Eventually, Hungary. Jews from every corner of the continent would pass through this place, most never knowing that it was the last place they would ever see. The doors of this factory never closed. Meanwhile, inside the SS offices at Auschwitz, bureaucrats worked like any corporate staff. They typed reports, stamped documents, compiled statistics. These documents did not mention murder. They mentioned intake, processing, and disposal. They didn't count people. They counted units. Units arrived. Units were removed. Units were processed. Hundreds of thousands of units. Each one once a living, breathing human being with a name, a voice, a story. It was genocide by paperwork. And still it grew. In early 1943, the first of the major crematoria, Crematorium II and III, entered full operation. Crematorium IV and V soon followed. Each was more refined than the bunkers, more advanced, faster. Birkenau's capacity to kill increased dramatically. Trains rolled in day and night. SS officers commented on how smoothly things were running. Sonderkommando members described how the sky was never fully clear. Smoke always hung over the camp. The earth around the new buildings turned dark, saturated with ash. It was around this time that something strange began to happen among the prisoners. Even though they suspected what the camp really was, they could no longer see it fully. The scale of it was too big to comprehend. It wasn't human. It wasn't war. It was something different, something new, something that belonged to nightmares and machinery, not real life. Many prisoners lost their grasp on reality. They could not process the idea that humans were doing this deliberately, but humans were. And Birkenau was now their masterpiece. The SS began optimizing the process even further. They tested Zyklon B amounts. How much was needed for 200? For 1,000? They recorded how long it took to kill children versus adults. They studied how cremation efficiency was affected by fat content in bodies. They used phrases like load, production, capacity, utilization. That's when survivors later described Birkenau using 2 words. Death factory. By now, Birkenau was no longer just a camp. It was the central part of the system, the largest killing center in history, the destination where Europe's Jews were sent not to live, but to disappear. But still, it was not finished, because something else was coming, something bigger, something that would push Birkenau beyond what it had already become. A wave so large that even the 4 crematoria would not be enough. A wave that made death pits burn day and night. A wave from Hungary. And when the trains rolled in, everything, the smoke, the screams, the fire, the machinery of death, would reach its peak. Birkenau was ready. Chapter 4, Bunkers 1 and 2. The first killing facilities of Birkenau. The snowy silence of Birkenau was broken only by the whistle of distant trains and the barking of dogs. But beyond the barracks, past the unfinished fences, hidden behind a thin line of trees, stood 2 buildings that did not appear on official maps. No signs marked their entrance. No records acknowledged their existence. They were just 2 former Polish farmhouses, isolated, ordinary-looking, yet somehow wrong. The prisoners whispered their names, the Little Red House and the Little White House. The Germans called them Bunker 1 and Bunker 2. They were the first killing facilities at Birkenau. And although they looked harmless, what took place inside them would change the world forever. It began in the spring of 1942. The architects of death had already abandoned the idea of mass shootings. Bullets were too slow, too loud, too psychologically damaging for the men who used them, and not efficient enough for the numbers the regime now sought to eliminate. They needed something faster, Something quieter. Something that could kill not dozens, but hundreds at a time. Something that did not feel like murder, but simply a process. That's when Zyklon B became the weapon of choice. Odorless. Tasteless. Invisible. Perfect. Bunker 1 stood in a clearing, an old cottage with brick walls that had once housed Polish farmers. Now, its windows were sealed shut. Its attic emptied. Its floors reinforced. The walls were lined with wooden panels to hide the modifications. From the outside, it still looked like a farmhouse. But inside, it had become something entirely different. The SS called it a special treatment facility, a phrase that came to mean only one thing: extermination. The first test happened one cold afternoon. A group of Jewish prisoners, mostly from Slovakia, was brought into the farmhouse. They had been told they were going to shower. They were tired, confused, but calm. Many carried small bags with personal items. They had been told they would get them back after washing. When the doors were sealed and Zyklon B pellets were poured through small openings in the ceiling, the screaming began. It lasted only minutes. Then silence. Utter, suffocating silence. The SS officers, watching through tiny peepholes, said nothing. They only recorded time. 7 minutes until complete stillness. Efficient, one officer wrote. Scalable. Birkenau had officially become a killing ground. From that day forward, the little red house was never empty. Trucks arrived almost daily, bringing groups of women, children, the elderly, and the sick. Those deemed unfit for work were sent directly to Bunker 1. There was no documentation, no record of names, just whispers disappearing into the wind. Prisoners saw mothers holding children, confused old men clutching prayer books, babies wrapped in blankets. They disappeared behind the trees, into the red house, never to return. But the Germans needed more. The killings were not fast enough, not organized enough. The architects wanted a smoother process, so they converted a second farmhouse, Bunker 2, the so-called Little White House. This one was larger, more isolated, surrounded by trees thick enough to shield it from view. It had 2 main rooms, each capable of holding more than 500 people at once. The windows were sealed with bricks. Ventilation openings were carved higher into the walls. The ground around it was lined with trenches for what came after. For the disposal. The killings now became routine. Victims were told they would bathe. Some were given soap, towels, sometimes even numbers for supposed after-shower food distribution. It was all deception. The SS didn't need force. They needed cooperation of the deceived. That was the brutal brilliance of the system. It killed without chaos, without resistance. The Sonderkommando, the forced prisoner units chosen to handle the bodies, were the only ones who knew the full truth. They dragged corpses from the bunkers, stripped them of valuables, cut hair, removed gold teeth, and loaded them onto carts. They wept silently as they worked. But they could not scream. They could not warn. They were forced to help death work more quickly. And when they had learned too much, when they had seen too much, they too were killed, replaced by new Sonderkommando prisoners who would repeat the cycle. They had no names, only numbers. They were never meant to leave. Around Bunker 1 and 2, the earth began to change color. Ash and bone collected in pits. Fat from burned bodies soaked into the soil. The ground turned gray, then black. The smell was impossible to describe. Prisoners said it was bitter, sweet, and disgusting, all at the same time. Dogs refused to go near it. Birds no longer landed in the trees. Nature itself recoiled. Yet, to the SS, it was only a beginning. These bunkers were temporary. Prototypes. Tests of a system that would soon expand beyond anything the world had ever seen. Heinrich Himmler himself visited Birkenau in July 1942. He walked calmly across the damp grounds, his boots polished, his face expressionless. He watched as a group of Dutch Jewish families walked toward Bunker 2. He stood silently as they entered and waited. When the process ended, he nodded once. His verdict, good, but not fast enough. That was the moment Birkenau stepped across an invisible threshold. This was no longer merely killing. This was industrial extermination. It needed scale. Speed. Precision. It needed infrastructure. It needed a system. The decision was made that very week. For new crematoria would be built at Birkenau. Not cottages turned into gas chambers, but buildings designed from the ground up for extermination. With underground undressing rooms, sealed gas chambers, ventilation systems, and 52 muffled furnaces. The design of death had been perfected, but until those facilities were ready, the bunkers would continue to work. Day after day, night after night, transports increased. From Slovakia, from Belgium, from France, from Holland, from Germany, from Croatia, from Austria, later from Greece, Italy, and Hungary. Entire communities disappeared. One morning, a train arrived filled only with children, orphans from a ghetto in Poland. They laughed and played in the open wagons, unaware of where they were going. Some held dolls. Some clutched pieces of bread. They didn't know they were going to the little white house. But the guards did. The SS maintained one rule: no photographs, no records, no witnesses. Birkenau's early killing facilities would remain ghost buildings, undocumented, unacknowledged, erased from official maps. But they could not erase the smell. They could not erase the ash that blew across the camp like gray snow. They could not erase the look in the eyes of the Sonderkommando. The bunkers blended into nature, but nature was watching. One prisoner later said, "There were no graves. The air became the grave." In late 1942, cracks began to appear, not in the buildings, but in the conscience of some guards. A few could no longer bear it. They asked for reassignment. They drank heavily. Some had nightmares. One wrote in his diary, "The worst part is not seeing them die. The worst part is seeing them believe that they're going to live." That man was later transferred to the Eastern Front. The deception was total. The efficiency was total. The silence was total. And beneath that silence, Birkenau underwent its most profound transformation. It was no longer just a camp that killed. It was becoming a camp that could kill endlessly, efficiently, without interruption, without evidence. But the bunkers were still only the beginning. Soon, the crematoria would replace them. Bigger, faster, stronger, more hidden, more efficient. A new kind of death, industrial, mechanical, systematic, was about to begin. The little red house and the little white house would soon vanish into the shadows of history. But their legacy would not. They were the origin of the system. The first places where extermination became a process, where killing became a schedule, where genocide became routine. And as smoke rose above the trees and darkness settled over Birkenau, the final stage of the killing machine drew nearer. The system was almost ready. The trains were coming. The gates would open, and Birkenau would never be the same again. Chapter 5. The camp opens. Selections, tattooing, and daily horror. The ramp at Birkenau was a stage, but not for life. It was where fate was decided in seconds, silently, by a flick of a gloved hand. One direction meant slavery, starvation, and suffering without end. The other direction meant death. Quick, quiet, efficient death. When the first train arrived directly inside Birkenau in early 1943, something changed forever. Until then, trains had stopped outside, and prisoners had walked or been transported into the camp. But now, rail lines curved directly into the heart of the camp, like veins pumping blood into a machine. Machine of death. The first passengers stepped down, blinking into the gray daylight. They were not soldiers, not criminals. They were families, mothers, children, grandparents, farmers, doctors, violinists, teachers. Some carried suitcases with embroidered initials. Some held children too young to understand fear. They looked around, searching for signs. Perhaps a welcome office. Perhaps a shelter. But what they found instead were men in black uniforms, dogs straining on leashes, and SS doctors pointing. A line of prisoners in striped uniforms stood nearby, their eyes sunken, their faces expressionless. They had seen this before. They would see it again the next day, and the next, and the next, until their souls could feel no more. The selections began. The SS did not shout. They did not push or beat. They simply pointed. Left, right, left, right. The healthy-looking men, teenagers, and some women were sent right to the camp. The children, mothers with infants, the elderly, the injured, sent left. Some asked, "How long until we see our families again?" The guards did not answer. They only pointed. The ramp smelled of coal smoke, wet wool, and fear. Dogs barked. Babies cried. SS officers barked numbers. People tried to stay together. Families begged not to be separated. But separation was the first rule of Birkenau. A rule enforced by silence, by smirks, by calmness. The calmness of men who believed they were not killing. They were processing. A young girl saw her father walk right while she was sent left with her mother and baby brother. She tried to run to him. A guard extended his arm in front of her, without emotion. She never saw her father again. Those sent to the right passed beneath a sign that read, "Arbeit macht frei." Work sets you free. They did not know it was a cruel joke. Work did not free anyone. It only delayed their death. Before they entered the main camp, they were taken to processing. They were lined up, stripped of their clothes, and ordered to leave their belongings in a pile. "You will get them back later," a guard lied. Clothes, shoes, family photographs, wedding rings, all thrown into heaps that stretched across the floor. A single photo of a child's birthday lay trampled into the mud. Then came the tattooing. Unlike other camps, where prisoners kept their numbers only on uniforms, Auschwitz chose to tattoo the prisoner's arm. A permanent mark. A number. A branding. Inked into flesh. Unforgettable. Irremovable. As if saying, "You will die, but your number will remain." They used needles, sometimes stamping machines. The pain was sharp, but worse was the humiliation. Names disappeared. Nationalities disappeared. Identities disappeared. You are no longer Maria. You are A17245. You are no longer Samuel. You are B71342. That was all the Nazis wanted from them. To erase the person and leave only the count. Some fainted. Some sobbed. Some said nothing at all. The next stage was the clothing. They were handed thin, striped uniforms. No socks. No proper shoes. Just wooden clogs that blistered their feet and tore their heels. Some got oversized coats. Others got none at all. They shivered, not just from cold, but from the realization that they would never wear normal clothes again. Then camp life began. Barracks stretched endlessly, like shadows across a mud-soaked landscape. Rows of wooden sheds, originally meant for horses, now stuffed with prisoners. Triple bunks, stacked like shelves in a warehouse. Straw-filled sacks replaced mattresses. Rats replaced pillows. The smell was overwhelming, a combination of human sweat, mold, feces, and sickness. The floors were wet. The walls leaked. The air was thick, stale, suffocating. The prisoners soon learned the rhythm of the camp. If you survived selection, your real test began. Wait before dawn. Stand outside in the freezing air for roll call. Hours standing still. No movement allowed. No speaking. No sitting. The SS counted every prisoner. If one was missing, they counted again. Then again. Sometimes for hours. Until the missing body was found, alive, dead, or frozen standing. After inspection, came breakfast, if it could be called that. A cup of black liquid called coffee, but it wasn't coffee. It was warm water, stained with roasted barley. Sometimes, if lucky, crumbs of bread. Then work began. Work was never chosen. It was assigned, and the camp did not care if you had been a judge, teacher, painter, or engineer in your former life. Now, you were a labor unit, a tool, and tools did not choose. Many were sent to carry bricks, drag heavy logs, or dig ditches in the frozen ground. Some were sent to the warehouses called Canada, where belongings of murdered prisoners were sorted: clothes, gold, shoes, baby items. Some were ordered to clean barracks, scrub latrines, or move corpses. There were also skilled labor assignments. Some prisoners who knew carpentry, mechanics, or tailoring had a slightly better chance of survival. Their lives sometimes lasted weeks, some even months. But survival was temporary. Everyone understood that. Every day in Birkenau tested every part of the human body and every part of the human soul. Hunger was constant, merciless, unrelenting. Stomachs growled like wild animals. Men dreamed not of freedom, but of bread. A crust of bread became more valuable than gold. Prisoners would trade shoes, blankets, even their dignity to taste it. They fought for it, stole it, risked death for it. Soup was a thin, watery liquid, sometimes with pieces of rotten vegetables floating in it. The bread was hard, moldy, but nobody cared. Prisoners held their bowls like lifelines. Diseases spread quickly. Typhus, cholera, dysentery, malaria-like fevers. Sickness moved from bunk to bunk, claiming bodies that were too weak to fight. SS doctors did not treat them. Instead, they wrote down their numbers for selection. Selection, the most dreaded word inside Birkenau. Sometimes, selections didn't only happen at the ramp. Sometimes they came to the barracks. Nazi doctors walked through, looking for anyone too thin, too weak, too sick. They didn't ask questions. They didn't test. They simply looked. That one, and that one, and that one. Those chosen were told they were being moved to recovery blocks for rest. They were not. They were being moved to the crematoria. Another part of Birkenau's daily life was psychological death. People began to forget their names, forget their pasts, forget dates, words, even their own memories. They became ghosts in their own bodies. A prisoner later said, "The body died slowly, but the soul died quickly." There were moments, however rare, where sparks of humanity still flickered. A secret prayer whispered, a scrap of bread shared, a lullaby sung to a child before selection. In those moments, survival wasn't measured by heartbeat, but by heart. And yet, survival was not the goal of Birkenau. Birkenau did not operate like a prison, or a camp, or even a battlefield. Birkenau operated like a conveyor belt. People arrived. They were sorted. The strong ones were degraded, starved, beaten, and slowly killed. The weak ones were sent straight to death. No time wasted. The camp's leadership measured everything in numbers. How many arrived? How many were processed? How many were disposed? They used charts, diagrams, graphs, efficiency reports. Death was not a tragedy. It was a statistic. And Birkenau was statistically perfect. One prisoner recalled hearing an SS guard say, "We don't hate you. We just don't care you exist." And that was the darkest truth. Hate was not the fuel of Birkenau. Indifference was. The victims weren't seen as enemies, or threats, or rivals. They were seen as nothing. And that was why killing them became so easy. By late 1943, the system was running smoothly. Trains arrived daily, sometimes 3 or 4 in a single day. Ramp selections flowed like a well-organized assembly line. Barracks overflowed with the living. Crematoria overflowed with the dead. Smoke drifted across fences, clinging to clothes, skin, and memory. There were no graves in Birkenau, only chimneys. And from those chimneys rose the final evidence of existence. Ash, drifting silently away on the wind. Day after day, week after week, thousands disappeared into that wind. But Birkenau was still evolving, still expanding, still perfecting, because soon something bigger was coming. Something that would push Birkenau's killing system to its breaking point. Something that would test just how efficient extermination could become. And when it came, even the crematoria would not be enough. It would be the greatest wave of death Birkenau would ever see. And it was coming on rails, from Hungary. And Birkenau was waiting. Chapter 6, the Sonderkommando, witnesses to the machinery of death. They arrived not by choice, not by selection, but by fate. Fate delivered them to the darkest job in the history of humanity. Fate marked them for the task no human being should ever be forced to do. Yet they did it. Not because they wanted to, not because they agreed, but because Birkenau allowed no choices. These were the prisoners known as the Sonderkommando, the special unit. The men who handled death so closely that death itself began to live inside them. Their assignment was never explained to them at first. When taken from their barracks, they thought they were being moved to a work detail, perhaps a kitchen or construction unit. They were separated from the others, marched to a secluded corner behind the crematoria. They saw strange buildings, large chimneys, sealed rooms, carts on rails. They saw piles of shoes, dresses, children's toys, stacks of dentures. They smelled something bitter, sweet, greasy, and unbearable. They did not yet fully know what it was. They soon would. A whistle blew. A door opened. And inside, they saw their future. Inside the crematoria, the air was heavy and humid. The walls were thick, brick-lined, stained with moisture. The floor was smooth from washing, but still smelled of something metallic. Something like burnt sugar. Something like decay. Their eyes did not want to understand what they were seeing. Bodies. Not a few. Not dozens. Hundreds. Twisted, tangled, piled like discarded dolls. Men, women, children. Some with their arms raised, as if trying to reach the ceiling. Some with faces frozen in fear, mouths open in silent screams. Some curled like infants. Some still clutching a hand that would never release. In that moment, the Sonderkommando understood. They were not just prisoners. They were now part of the machinery. When the SS commander entered, his tone was cold, businesslike, not sadistic, not angry, just efficient. He told them exactly what to do. Remove the bodies. Separate them. Strip valuables. Remove glasses, shoes, jewelry. Cut the hair. Fill the carts. Load the furnaces. Clean the floors. Wash the walls. Prepare the room for the next transport. He used that word, transport. Not murder. Not victims. Transports. It sounded like freight. And that was how they were treated. Like cargo. Some prisoners refused to move. They stood frozen, unable to look at the bodies. One began to scream. Another tried to run. The SS guards did not shout. They did not threaten. A single gunshot ended the resistance. The rest understood. They began to work. Their hands shook. Their legs trembled. Some closed their eyes. Some couldn't. Some whispered apologies to the dead. Others whispered prayers. One simply whispered, "Forgive me," again and again, until his voice went hoarse. The process was unbearable, but it had to be done quickly. The crematoria were on a schedule, a killing schedule. To the SS, the Sonderkommando were not workers. They were cleaners, custodians of mass murder, hidden from view, sealed off from other prisoners, serving inside the heart of Birkenau's killing factory. They lived beside the flames, slept within the smell, walked among ashes that used to be people. In Birkenau, there were different horrors. Some people were starved. Some were beaten. Some were gassed. But the Sonderkommando faced something else. Something worse. They faced knowledge. They knew everything. They were the only ones who saw what happened from beginning to end. They saw the deception. They saw the people arrive, clutching suitcases, thinking they were going to showers. They saw the faces change when the doors locked. They heard the screams, then the silence, and then they opened the doors. They saw what genocide looked like, up close, in their hands. But their work didn't end with removing bodies. They were forced to process what was left. The camp did not just kill. It harvested. Human hair was shaved off because it could be used in German factories. Gold teeth were extracted from corpses to be melted into bars. Eyeglasses were sorted, their metal melted down for military use. Bones that did not fully burn were crushed into dust using hand-operated grinders. The ashes were shoveled, scooped, and dumped into rivers, ponds, or used to fill pathways. Nothing was wasted, not even the dead. A Sonderkommando prisoner later wrote, "We were not living among death. We were living inside it." Suicide was frequent, not by hanging or poison, but by running directly toward electrified fences, or simply collapsing and refusing to stand. But most did not kill themselves, not because they didn't want to, but because they had seen what the SS did with Sonderkommando suicides. They were replaced. Immediately. Those who survived felt obligated to continue, if only to bear witness, if only to remember. The Sonderkommando had no access to camp life. They could not talk to regular prisoners. They could not gather. They could not pray openly. They were housed near the crematoria, in isolated blocks, guarded closely, fed slightly better, not as mercy, but as necessity. They had to be strong enough to lift bodies, strong enough to drag, carry, shovel, burn. They saw too much. And for that reason, their lives were temporary. Sonderkommando units were usually liquidated after a few months. They were shot, gassed, or burned alive, then replaced by new ones. The SS wanted no witnesses. But witnesses remained. Some Sonderkommando members secretly wrote diaries, testimonies, notes. They buried them near the crematoria, sealed in glass jars or metal canisters. They wrote names, dates, numbers, descriptions. They wrote to the future. They wrote to us. In one note, a man named Zalman Gradowski wrote, "If the world ever asks, where was God in Auschwitz, tell them he was here, under these ashes, buried with the children. But ask instead, where was man?" In another, written in trembling handwriting, a prisoner said, "Remember us, we who saw the truth when the world was blind." Working inside the gas chambers was a nightmare with no end. Bodies came in daily, sometimes 600, sometimes 1,000, sometimes more. Sometimes entire villages disappeared in a single day. They saw wedding gowns still in suitcases, children's drawings tucked into pockets. They saw one woman clutch something in her hand. It was bread, still warm. She had been holding it for her son. That bread went into the fire, along with everything else. The Sonderkommando were told never to speak to those about to be killed. But sometimes when a group was very calm and the guards were very far, they whispered. In those moments, they were not laborers, not numbers, but human again. One Sonderkommando member described seeing a rabbi praying, not loudly, not fearfully, but with calm. He stood tall, surrounded by his people, whispering, "The Lord is my shepherd," as cyanide pellets fell from above. The prisoners processing the bodies found his arm still raised toward heaven. There were moments when the Sonderkommando held bodies of people they knew, sometimes friends, sometimes family. One man recognized his wife among the dead. He fell to his knees, sobbing, refusing to move. The SS did not shoot him. They forced him to continue. Birkenau did not punish emotion. It erased it. But something happened in late 1944 that changed everything. The Sonderkommando, despite being isolated, had been planning. They had been remembering. They had been documenting. And now they would resist. They gathered stolen gunpowder smuggled by women from the munitions factory in Auschwitz. They dug tunnels beneath Crematorium IV. They built crude bombs. They timed it carefully. On October 7th, 1944, they revolted. They attacked the SS guards, set fire to the crematorium, destroyed machinery, tore down fences. They fought. They screamed. They died. One crematorium burned. Its roof collapsed. The SS regained control. Almost all Sonderkommando involved were executed. But something had changed. The machinery of death had been wounded. The SS began dismantling evidence. Crematoria were partially destroyed. Gas chambers disguised as air shelters. Ash dumped in ponds. Documents burned. Traces erased. But what they could never remove were the testimonies. The words buried in jars. The voices buried in ash. The knowledge held by the Sonderkommando. When the war ended, very few Sonderkommando prisoners survived. But those who did spoke. They spoke not with anger, not with blame, but with clarity. They did not describe only horror. They described humanity in its darkest and its most courageous form. They described men sharing bread, women singing lullabies in gas chambers, children hugging their grandparents at selections, rabbis praying, doctors comforting patients even as death approached, people walking to death with dignity. The Sonderkommando reminded the world that even where humanity was outlawed, it still survived. Here, at the center of Birkenau, the Sonderkommando were not just witnesses to death. They were witnesses to history, and they left behind a question that echoes through time. If the men forced to burn the dead could still remember the living, then what excuse do we have to forget? And as Birkenau prepared for its deadliest phase, the Hungarian deportations, the Sonderkommando stood ready, not to fight, but to remember, because memory is the only thing the gas could not kill. Chapter 7, Crematoria II, 3, 4, NV. Architecture of Annihilation. In the heart of Birkenau, where silence swallowed screams and ash drifted like snow, for buildings rose like monsters from the earth. They were cold, rectangular, industrial, almost bland. No swastikas, no slogans, no warnings. Just concrete, brick, sealed doors, and tall chimneys. Chimneys that never stopped breathing smoke. Crematoria II, 3, 4, NV. The most efficient killing structures in human history. Not makeshift bunkers or converted cottages. These were engineered facilities, designed from the blueprints up for one purpose only. Not imprisonment, not punishment, not even cruelty, just extermination. Precise, industrial, systematic extermination. They were designed like factories. But instead of raw materials, they received human beings. Instead of producing goods, they produced smoke. The idea behind these structures was simple and horrifying. Killing needed to be faster, cleaner, quieter, and less psychologically damaging to the killers. The Einsatzgruppen death squads had found mass shootings messy and emotionally draining for SS officers. Bullets were noisy. Blood was chaotic. Faces at close range were haunting. The new process needed to remove emotion, remove humanity, remove resistance. It had to feel like procedure, like logistics, like administration. Heinrich Himmler wanted death to feel like paperwork. And so, in mid-1942, a chilling phrase began appearing in internal Nazi communications: Ein Fabrik des Todes, a factory of death. Karl Bischoff, the SS architect, began planning. The crematoria were not just built, they were designed. Every brick, every pipe, every vent was carefully placed. The blueprints looked technical, almost boring. Rectangles, arrows, measurements. But those rectangles were gas chambers. Those arrows showed the movement of bodies. Those measurements calculated how many could fit inside at once. When the drawings were complete, they did not read, "People in, ashes out." But that was exactly what they meant. Crematorium II was the first to be built. It had a basement. On the plans, it was labeled as Leichenkeller, morgue. But morgues do not need airtight doors. Morgues do not need ventilation systems designed for rapid cleansing. Morgues do not need fake shower heads. Yet these rooms had all of that. Victims would enter through wooden double doors into the undressing hall, a long, underground room with hooks lining the walls. They were told to leave their clothes there, to remember their peg number, to collect their belongings after the shower. Some believed it. Some tried to believe it. Why else would a shower room have numbered hooks? From the undressing room, they were pushed into another underground chamber. The floor was smooth, the ceiling low. Pillars stood in the center, each with vents on top. The room had no drains, no water pipes, no windows, no natural light. The doors sealed tight. People whispered nervously. Children cried. Mothers tried to calm them. And then, the steel doors slammed shut. Pellets of Zyklon B were dropped in from ceiling vents. Blue-green crystals, harmless while dry, deadly when heated by human breath. In minutes, the screams turned to silence. Often, the silence lasted longer than the screaming. The Sonderkommando would wait, then open the doors. That was when Crematorium III opened. It was the same design. Mirror image. Underground chambers. Mechanical ventilation. Multiple furnaces. Muffled. Insulated. Oil-soaked concrete floors to absorb fat drippings. Steel stretchers. Trolleys for transferring bodies. And deep pits beneath for ash collection. This was no longer murder. This was extermination. Organized. Balanced. Efficient. In Crematoria II and III, 4,000 people could be killed and burned in 24 hours. But that was not enough. Birkenau needed more. So, Crematorium IV and V were built. Above ground this time. Cheaper, faster, less complex. The Nazis had perfected the process. No need for complicated basements. They needed facilities that could open quickly, kill quickly, burn quickly, and, most importantly, be destroyed quickly, if necessary, when evidence would later need to disappear. Crematoria IV and V were simpler, but just as deadly. Gas chambers looked like storage rooms. Brick walls, few windows, single-door entrance, but with one difference, for separate gassing rooms. Smaller chambers meant faster cycles. Crematorium IV could gas up to 1,200 people in one operation. Crematorium V, about 1,500. Doors shut. Zyklon B poured through roof vents. Within minutes, silence. The furnaces in these buildings were fewer, but they had something else. Open-air burning pits, dug behind the structures. When the furnaces could not keep up, the pits were used. The Sonderkommando stacked bodies like firewood. Fat melted. Flames rose. The air turned thick, greasy, and sweet. The SS were proud. Inside the administration offices, SS clerks prepared daily reports. They used neat charts, columns, totals, trains received, units processed. Ungarn Juden, Hungarian Jews, 93,000 this week. Estimated cremation output, on track. Targets met. The SS discussed death like accountants balancing ledgers. The engineers discussed death like technicians improving performance. The SS doctors discussed death like sanitation managers, calmly, clinically detached. One report from August 1944 read, Crematorium II produced high-volume smoke. Recommend temporary shift to pit burning to reduce strain. It did not mention that the smoke was from children. The crematoria ran with military precision. Work began before dawn. SS guards stood outside with stopwatches. Each process, undressing, chamber filling, gassing, ventilation, removal, burning, was timed. Sometimes, entire cycles were completed in under 2 hours. One Sonderkommando wrote, the only thing in Birkenau that ran smoothly was death. But even machines malfunction. In Crematorium IV, a ventilation failure caused toxic fumes to leak into the operator's area. SS guards panicked. Some collapsed. Some vomited. Some had to be dragged out. Panic spread. The SS temporarily shut down operations. But shut down did not mean stopping killing. It meant moving operations to the open pits. The crematoria were not the only structures that defined Birkenau. The ramp defined it too, because that was where the process began. Trains arrived often at night. Smoke from the chimneys glowed red in the darkness. Dogs barked. Guards assembled. And then people got off. Confused, shivering, exhausted. They were told, leave your suitcases. Leave your valuables. They'll be safe. They were told, men this way, women and children that way. They were told, work camp or showers. They never suspected that showers had chimneys. The selections were fast. Doctors pointed left or right. One group kept their shoes. The other did not. Later, the SS would boast, no one ever realized they were being sent to die. Except sometimes they did. One man, a father, saw the gas chamber door. Something clicked. He screamed, they lied. They lied. He tried to run. He held his daughter's hand. He told others. People panicked. The SS fired warning shots. A dog attacked. Within seconds, SS guards regained control. People stopped running. Some sensed the truth, but accepted it. Others refused to accept it, and their sanity broke. Birkenau crushed not only bodies, but minds. The crematoria became symbols, not of death, but of something worse, absence. Most mass murder sites leave behind evidence. Graves, shell casings, bones. But Birkenau did not leave graves. It left ash. Ashen rivers. Ashen ponds. Ashen fields. Ashen clouds. The earth at Birkenau did not hold bodies. It held dust. There was nowhere to mourn. Only everywhere. Even the SS understood the symbolism. That was why they prepared to destroy the crematoria long before Allied armies arrived. They knew their factories would need to disappear. But by then, their secret was too large to hide. Birkenau was not just a place. It was a symbol of industrial death. It was the moment humanity discovered that mass murder could be streamlined. The crematoria represented something chilling. Not hatred, not madness, but logic. Cold, mechanical logic. The logic of numbers. The logic of efficiency. The logic that said it is cheaper to kill people with gas than with bullets. That you can burn faster if you use body fat as fuel. That one unit can be processed in 23 minutes. Birkenau was not just built by cruelty. It was built by calculation. By architects. By engineers. By men with rulers, blueprints, and clean hands. And yet, something slipped through that machinery. Memory. Witness. Truth. There were people who saw. People who documented. People who risked everything to bury notes, steal photographs, sketch diagrams of the crematoria, write descriptions of what happened. These sketches, found after the war, prove that the gas chambers existed, even before the Nazis destroyed them. In the ruins of Crematorium III, investigators later found building foundations, gas-tight doors, ventilation pipes, and melted furnace frames. Physical evidence of death on an unimaginable scale. The Nazis tried to erase the crematoria, but could not erase what they had created. Because once you turn death into a factory, once you build a place where ash replaces graves, once you design a system where human lives are processed like cargo, you leave a mark, not on buildings, but on history. And Crematoria II, III, IV, and V left the deepest mark of all. The mark that proved what humanity was capable of building, not just with hatred, but with logic. And yet the system was not at full capacity. Not yet, because something was coming. Something that would test the limits of the crematoria. Something that would flood Birkenau with more people, more trains, more ash than it had ever processed before. The summer of 1944, the Hungarian Jews, the fastest, deadliest, most destructive operation in the camp's history. And when the trains began to arrive, the sky above Birkenau did not turn gray. It turned black. Chapter 8. Life in Sector BII. Family camp, quarantine, women's camp. The sun did not rise in Birkenau. It appeared. Gray, weak, indifferent. Light didn't warm the ground here. It only revealed it. Revealed the wire, the mud, the watchtowers that carved fear into the horizon. And beneath their shadow stood Sector BII, Birkenau's largest camp sector. A place that was not death, not yet, but not life either. A waiting room between existence and disappearance. A place where people did not die in gas chambers, but slowly, painfully, invisibly, every day. Sector BII was divided like a broken mirror. Each reflection held a different kind of suffering. BIA, the quarantine camp. BIB, the women's camp. BIC, the men's camp. BIE, the gypsy family camp. BID, the Czech family camp from their science stat. BIF, the hospital camp, though no one was healed there. Between them stood fences. Between them stood desperation. This was the part of Birkenau most people don't talk about. The part where life was not taken instantly, but dismantled, layer by layer. Where the SS did not kill with gas, but with hunger, disease, cold, confusion, and time. Here, people lived, but not as they once had. They lived measured in hours, sometimes days. They lived until they couldn't. The first arrival to Sector BII was not a train full of condemned families, but groups of prisoners selected to work. They passed initial ramp selection, believing they had been spared the worst. Yet when they stepped into the barracks of BII, they realized they had entered another kind of death. The ground was never dry. Mud soaked everything, even when it hadn't rained. Feet sank. Wooden clogs broke. To walk from barack to barack felt like dragging stones. The prisoners' shoes rotted from dampness. Their skin cracked from cold. The mud stuck to everything. Clothes, hair, the soul. That was the first thing they learned. Birkenau was not only a place of fire and ash. It was also a place of mud. Endless, choking living mud. The barracks were originally stable barns, designed for horses, not humans. Dark, wide, with no insulation. Inside, there were wooden shelves stacked 3 levels high, like crates for storing cargo. Except these crates held human beings. 300 to 500 prisoners per barrack, sometimes more. Beds were not beds, but rough wooden planks. Some had a thin layer of moldy straw. Some had nothing. Prisoners lay shoulder to shoulder, sometimes sideways, so more could fit. They breathed in each other's air. Their sweat, their disease. Disease became the true ruler of Birkenau. Typhus spread first, then dysentery, then tuberculosis, then fever without a name, without a cure. You knew a person was sick when they stopped speaking, when their eyes looked at something that wasn't there, when they didn't fight for bread anymore. That was when the camp had taken them. There was no medicine. Hospital blocks were just rooms where the dying were placed so they wouldn't infect the useful ones. There, straw mats were soaked with diarrhea and blood. There, death was slow. There, no one screamed. They were too tired. But life in Sector BII was not only defined by sickness. It was also defined by waiting. Waiting for soup. Waiting for roll call. Waiting for bodies to be removed. Waiting for sleep. Waiting for death. Morning men appel. Roll call. Prisoners were forced to stand outside in freezing wind or burning sun for hours. Standing still. No talking. No moving. No fainting. If someone collapsed, they were kicked until they stood again. If they couldn't stand, they were dragged aside and left to die. One prisoner later said, "I would have preferred the gas chamber to roll call." After roll call came the chase for water. Not clean water. Just water. 2 taps for thousands of people. The line was endless. Some waited hours. Some never reached it. Some drank from puddles. Puddles that were mixed with mud and urine. Food was worse. Food was never enough. Food was never food. Morning. Brownish water called coffee. It was not coffee. Midday. Soup. They called it soup, but it was mostly boiled water with a few vegetables and sometimes potato peels. Evening. Bread. A slice, so small you could hide it in your palm. That bread became life. It became currency. It became hope. Prisoners would trade anything for a piece of bread. A spoon. A button. A photograph of their children. Some sold their shoes for bread. Some sold their dignity. Some sold their future. Meals were eaten from rusty tins and old helmets found in garbage. Those who had a bowl guarded it like treasure. Those who didn't, they used their hands. Food in Birkenau was not eaten. It was fought for. It was swallowed before others could see. It was survival, reduced to instinct. There were moments when the wind blew just right, and the prisoners could smell something else. Burning hair, burning meat, burning bone. They smelled what they would become. But most did not talk about it. Talking made it real. Sector BII had many camps within it, but one of the strangest was the Versailles family camp, BIID. Unlike other parts of the camp, families were kept together there. Children stayed with parents. Suitcases were allowed. They wore normal clothes instead of camp uniforms. No immediate selections. No tattoos. It seemed almost humane. It was not. It was a deception. This camp had one purpose: to convince outside organizations like the Red Cross that Auschwitz was not a death camp. These families were kept alive, briefly, so they could be shown to the world. They were allowed food, more than others. They were allowed rest. They could even write letters home, carefully censored. But after 6 months, every one of them was sent to the gas chambers. Not one survived. Almost 20,000 people. Entire families. Erased. Their existence was only proof that Birkenau could lie when it wanted to. Not far away, in BIE, was the Gypsy family camp. One of the strangest places in all of Auschwitz. Entire Roma communities lived there. Men, women, children, elders, kept together like in a village. They sang at night. They told stories. Some even danced. They believed they would live. Then one night, in August 1944, SS trucks arrived. Floodlights turned the camp white like day. Dogs barked. Children began to cry. They were told they would be resettled. They were not. Every one of them, almost 3,000 Roma, was taken to Crematorium V. Children screamed. Men fought. Women held babies close. Some guard hesitated. Some looked away. But the doors closed, and the Gypsy camp was gone. Sector BII also held women in BIIB. Their suffering had a different shape. Mothers watched their children taken away at selections. Pregnant women were often sent straight to gas chambers. Those who gave birth in the camp, their newborns were drowned in buckets, thrown into latrine pits. Some mothers begged to see their babies one last time. Some tried to hide them. Some watched them die in their arms. Men died like numbers. Women died like ghosts. In the women's camp, lice ruled. Lice crawled through hair, burrowed into clothing, spread fever, spread death. Women cut their hair not to look beautiful, but to stop the itching. They scratched their skin raw until it bled. Some women worked in the Canada warehouses, sorting belongings stolen from those murdered. Clothes, photographs, dolls, diaries, letters, jewelry. They worked in rooms full of memories. That was its own kind of torture. But Canada had one advantage. Food scraps, better clothes, sometimes even soap. Working there meant living a little longer. In the men's camp, BID, prisoners built roads. Except there were no roads to build. They hauled stones from one place to another, then back again. It was work without purpose, work designed to break the body and the will. Prisoners had one secret wish: not to survive, not to escape, just to die quickly. Some prayed for the gas. Sector BII was not like the crematoria. It did not kill in minutes. It killed slowly. It killed by waiting. Waiting for food. Waiting for sleep. Waiting for death. This was Birkenau's other face. The face that did not scream, but groaned. The face that did not burn, but rotted. The face that did not shock, but numbed. In this part of Birkenau, people didn't ask, "Will I die?" They asked, "How many days?" And yet, life continued. Because in Sector BII, people held on to something the SS could not fully kill. Prayer, whispers, memories. A mother drawing her child's face in the dirt. A rabbi reciting blessings over crumbs of bread. Two prisoners falling in love, knowing it would never last. People still dreamed, even here, of food, of warmth, of rain that didn't smell like ash, of life, and, sometimes, even of rescue. At night, children would ask their mothers, "Are they coming?" The mothers did not know who they meant, but they said yes. They are coming. Soon. But soon, the camp would change again. Because soon, the trains would arrive. Not with hundreds, not with thousands, with hundreds of thousands. And the crematoria would no longer cope. Birkenau would become something even darker. And Sector BII, the place of slow death, would become something worse. It would become a waiting room for the fastest extermination in human history. Hungary was coming. And Birkenau was preparing to kill faster than ever before. Chapter 9. The Roma Genocide at Birkenau. Night fell like a curtain over Birkenau, but it didn't bring rest. It only hid some truths and exposed others. In the corner of Sector BII, behind barbed wire and floodlights, stood a section known as BI. It had a name, printed on SS records, though no one inside used it. It was called the Zigeunerlager, the Gypsy Family Camp. And it was unlike anything else in Auschwitz-Birkenau, because in this place, unlike all others, families stayed together. That strange difference, that single allowance, would first give hope, then lead to one of the most heartbreaking chapters of the Holocaust. They arrived in February 1943, not in separate transports for men and women, but in entire communities, families, grandparents, parents, and children. Some came from Germany, others from Poland, Austria, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Many came from Slovakia and the Czech lands. Later, large transports would arrive from Hungary and Croatia. They were Roma and Sinti. They were musicians, blacksmiths, horse trainers, traders, dancers, storytellers, wanderers. But here, they were only one thing: prisoners. Their wagons rolled through the gates. Horses, carts, pots, pans, baby blankets, old accordions, tools, dolls, and photographs came with them. They had not left home. They had been dragged away from it, bringing pieces of it with them, as if home could survive in a suitcase. When the gates opened, they saw something the Jewish prisoners did not see. Their families remained together. No ram selection, no immediate separation, no tattooing at first. Husbands, wives, children, elders, all kept in one place. The children laughed when they saw other children. Women cooked scraps of food together, telling stories by fire. Music could be heard, soft, quiet, borrowed from memory. It was strange. It felt almost like camp, not a death camp. And for a very short time, people believed the lie. BI had a false warmth. Children played, women braided each other's hair, men built stoves from scrap metal. A form of life emerged. But something was always wrong. Hunger grew. Disease spread. Roll calls lasted hours. Food portions were smaller than anywhere else in Birkenau. The babies cried through the nights. The mothers began to sink into silence. But even then, behind silence, something remarkable lived: community. The gypsy camp became a pocket of humanity inside a machine that tried to erase it. But soon, the machine turned its face. There were no crematoria flames at first. No guards shouting toward gas chambers. Death came quietly, in the form of typhus and dysentery. It swept through the camp like wind. Children clung to their mothers. Mothers clung to anyone who had medicine. No one had any. Sometimes a man would knock on the door of Block 29, the so-called hospital block, begging for help. But the camp had no medicine, just beds to die on. In February 1944, Joseph Mengele, the SS doctor known as the Angel of Death, arrived in Birkenau. He walked through the gypsy camp with interest. He watched children closely, especially twins. He liked twins. They were subjects for study. He selected several. He ordered them moved to Block 31. He smiled as they were taken away. He said he wanted to help them. But anyone who had seen his work knew that help was not what he offered. Mengele was fascinated by Roma. He studied their faces, hair, skin tone. He measured skulls. He ordered injections. He wrote notes. He treated human life as something to dissect. He used needles where words should have sufficed. He used force where care should have existed. He told himself it was science. It was not. The gypsy camp slowly changed. The fences grew taller. The guards more tense. The funerals more frequent. The smoke from the crematoria drifted closer. Families watched new arrivals on the ramp outside Sector BA, the Hungarian Jews. They saw mothers with babies disappear into the trees. They saw the sky turn black with ash. They understood. They understood they were next. Mengele began making lists. Not for labor, not for work, but for liquidation. The camp was no longer useful. It was diseased, starving, and most importantly, the lie was no longer needed. BI had served its purpose, to show outsiders that Auschwitz protected families. But no inspectors came. No Red Cross visits. The lie expired. And when lies expire, the truth steps in. The order came in late May 1944. The gypsy camp was to be liquidated, erased. Its inhabitants, over 6,000 still alive, removed from the register. Not transferred, not relocated, eliminated. But something happened the night before the planned liquidation. Something unexpected. The Roma resisted. It was the only collective act of resistance by prisoners in Birkenau before the Sonderkommando revolt later that year. They had no guns, no knives, no training. But when the SS came to collect them, ordering them to leave the barracks and line up, they refused to exit. They barricaded the doors, grabbed wood, tools, buckets, anything. Children clung to their fathers. Women stood in front of the doors. They knew what awaited them outside. Some shouted in German, "We know where you are taking us." The SS hesitated. It was unusual. They were used to silence, not defiance. They paused, then withdrew. No one died that night. But the end was not avoided, only postponed. A few weeks later, the SS returned. No warnings this time. No deception. No negotiations. Trucks arrived. Floodlights were turned on. The children cried before the doors opened. Men tried to form a line of protection. Some were beaten until they could not stand. Mothers clung to daughters. One woman held her baby so tightly, a guard had to pry her fingers open. They were loaded into trucks. Not all at once, but in hundreds, then thousands. The guards did not rush. They did not need to. They had time. The children begged to stay. The guards said nothing. They passed the barracks where they had once laughed, once played, once believed. They passed the fences. They passed the other prisoners watching silently, helplessly. They passed the ashes of those who arrived before them, and arrived where so many had before, the doors of Crematorium V. That night, almost 3,000 Roma were murdered in the gas chambers. There was no selection. There were no survivors. The camp was silent afterward. Even the dogs were silent. The chimney burned through the night, thicker and darker than usual, and the SS called it Sonderbehandlung, special treatment. Nothing more. By the next morning, the Roma camp was empty. Their belongings were gone. Their blankets, their dolls, their songs. Just empty barracks. Just echo. Then silence. Birkenau had many tragedies, but this was the only place where entire families walked into the gas chambers holding hands. The gypsy camp taught the world something about Auschwitz. It taught that genocide is not only about killing. It is about erasing, not just bodies, but songs, not just names, but stories, not just families, but entire cultures. Roma survivors who lived through other camps, through other horrors, would later say the same thing. We survived, but the camp did not just try to kill us. It tried to erase us. The world remembers many victims of the Holocaust, but for decades, it forgot the Roma. Almost 500,000 Roma and Sinti were murdered across Nazi-occupied Europe. Many in Birkenau. Few were counted. Fewer were named. The world remembered the crematoria, but not the music that once played in the mud beside them. The Jewish prisoners later said, when the Roma were gone, something inside Birkenau grew even darker. Because after the night of August 2nd, 1944, Birkenau had completed its mission. Gas had killed. Flame had erased. Ash had replaced memory. And silence had replaced song. Yet still one thing remained. One thing Birkenau could not kill. Witness. Memory. Truth. And truth would travel. Truth would escape. Truth, like smoke, would rise from the chimneys and refuse to disappear. Because even when the Nazis destroyed the buildings, burned the documents, and bulldozed the ruins, the stories remained. And, as we tell them now, we honor not just the dead, but the music that once lived, and will live again. But Birkenau was not finished. It would soon become something even darker. Because if killing children and families seemed cruel, what came next was something else entirely. The Hungarian Action, the fastest, deadliest, most mechanized extermination operation in the history of the Holocaust. And for that, the crematoria would burn day and night, until the sky itself turned black. Chapter 10. The Hungarian Action, Birkenau's deadliest summer. The sky over Birkenau in the summer of 1944 was different. It wasn't blue. It wasn't gray. It was red. Red from the flames, red from the smoke, red from the burning of thousands of bodies every day and every night. Prisoners would later say, that was the summer when the sun stopped shining. And it was true, not because cloud covered it, but because ash did. From May to July 1944, Birkenau became the deadliest place on earth. The machinery of extermination reached its peak. The gas chambers worked around the clock. The crematoria did not rest. The open pits burned day and night. The Sonderkommando stopped counting bodies. The SS stopped recording names. They counted only trains. They called it the Hungarian Action. It was not a military operation, not a battle. No shots fired, no defenses raised. Yet it was one of the largest extermination operations in human history. Nearly 437,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau in just 56 days. That is 8,000 people every day. One transport every 3 hours. A human tide. Families, whole villages, centuries of life. Riding on rails into a place built for death. Hungarian Jews were the last major Jewish population left in Nazi-controlled Europe. Germans had already deported Jews from Poland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Greece, Austria, Slovakia, Italy, Croatia, and half of Yugoslavia. But Hungary still held lives. Until March 1944, when Nazi Germany invaded Hungary under Operation Margaretti. And with invasion came bureaucracy. And with bureaucracy came deportation. Adolf Eichmann relocated to Budapest. He did not carry a weapon. He carried a clipboard. He did not command battalions. He commanded timetables. His weapon was not a rifle. It was a train schedule. He organized the deportation of 500,000 Jews faster than any extermination operation the Nazis had ever conducted. He was proud of it. He later called it the greatest logistical achievement of the final solution. The trains began leaving Hungary on May 15, 1944. Every single day, sometimes twice in a day, they traveled through Slovakia and into southern Poland, rattling toward Auschwitz-Birkenau. The trains did not bring criminals. They brought doctors, poets, violinists, farmers, bankers, philosophers, tailors, midwives, tailors, rabbis, students, children. They brought entire lives, all reduced to a passenger number on Eichmann's list. The trains arrived at Birkenau, mostly at night. Dark wagons, dim lanterns. The air smelled of coal, sweat, and distant smoke. When the doors opened, people stepped into the cold mud of the ramp. They looked around, barbed wire, towers, uniforms. But many still believed what they had been told, that this was a work camp. Some even saw signs for showers. They held on to that lie like a lifeline. The Hungarian Jews had the shortest wait time between arrival and death. Some were gassed within 2 hours of stepping off the train. No registration, no tattoo, no Barak. Their names never entered a document. They lived in Birkenau for only one moment, the moment between hope and realization. Selections during the Hungarian Action were not slow, not chaotic. They were efficient. Doctors stood at the ramp, not inside buildings. Guards did not need dogs. They did not need to shout. They did not need to push. They simply pointed. Right work. Left death. Those sent right often had no idea what that meant. They believed it meant life. But many died later from starvation or disease. Few ever understood they had escaped gas for now. Those sent left were told they were going to shower. They walked calmly. They undressed calmly. They entered calmly, and only understood when the doors locked. To accommodate the massive influx of people, the crematoria began what the SS called Sonderbetrieb, special operation. Crematoria II, III, IV, and V ran full capacity, day and night. Yet even that was not enough. The pits were reopened. The ground behind crematoria IV and V was dug deep, 8 meters wide, 50 meters long. Bodies were piled high in layers, body wood, and set on fire. The flames reached higher than the trees. SS guards watched with binoculars, observing burn rate. They adjusted wood placement. They discussed efficiency, the way one discusses farming or construction. The Sonderkommando described those pits as the darkest place in Birkenau. Smoke, heat, ash, and a smell that cannot be forgotten. One worker wrote, "It smelled like hair, like burning hair and sugar." Another wrote, "The air looked thick like wool." The heat was so intense that it burned eyebrows, eyelashes, even when standing meters away. Ash rained down like snow. The rivers turned gray. Birds stopped flying overhead. Some prisoners noticed something horrifying. When the fires burned too hot, they made a sound, not loud, but undeniable. A crackling, popping sound. The sound of marrow boiling inside bones. The SS ignored it. They only cared about smoke dispersal, wind direction, burn speed. One officer, in a report, described it not as burning bodies, but as open-air incineration. Just a process. But even these horrifying pits could not keep up with the numbers. The crematoria could not keep up. The trucks could not keep up. So the SS devised a cruel efficiency. They told families with young children to walk faster, told the elderly they would receive special treatment, and sometimes they threw infants directly over the pit walls. No chamber, no selection, no time, just flame. Even the Sonderkommando, who had seen everything, fell silent. Because this was not just death. This was extermination at maximum speed. The Hungarian Action lasted only 56 days, but it represented the peak of Birkenau's killing system. Never again would the crematoria work at such a pace. Never again would the flames burn so high. Never again would the sky be so black. One SS officer described it in his journal. The sky is never empty. Always smoke. Always ash. One Hungarian survivor, who worked sorting shoes, said, "We did not see faces. We saw shoes. Every shoe was a life. There were thousands of children's shoes. After the war, when these shoes were collected for documentation, there were more than 60,000 pairs. But not a single child remained to claim them. And yet, even amidst this darkness, some tried to resist. A woman named Rosa Roboda, who worked in the Crematoria warehouses, became aware of the Hungarian Action. She began secretly passing small packets of gunpowder to the Sonderkommando, one at a time, hidden in scraps of cloth. She knew the crematoria were the heart of the killing system. She knew they had to be destroyed. She helped make it possible. She was discovered in January 1945. She was hanged. Her final words were, "Be strong." She was 23. On July 9th, 1944, the last train from Hungary arrived. The ramp fell quiet for the first time in 2 months. The pits were covered with soil. The chimneys burned less often. The SS inspected the site, satisfied. They had completed the fastest mass extermination in modern history. Birkenau had reached its deadliest point, its peak, its saturation. It had murdered nearly 1 million people before, but during those 56 days, it became something else, something beyond numbers, beyond time, beyond comprehension. It became a wound in human history, a wound that would never fully close. After the Hungarian Action, Birkenau began to slow. The gas chambers still worked, but the urgency faded. The SS began preparing to hide evidence. Plans were made to demolish crematoria. Sonderkommando prisoners whispered about revolt. The war was turning. The Soviet army was approaching. Something new floated in the air. Possibility. Not of rescue. Not of freedom. But of truth. Truth that would outlive the fires. Truth that would survive the ashes. Truth that would escape even Birkenau. And as the summer of 1944 ended, some prisoners began to imagine something that had not existed in Birkenau for years. An ending. But Birkenau was not finished yet, because what came next was the slow collapse and the desperate attempt to erase everything. The autumn would bring not flames of extermination, but flames of destruction. The Nazis would try to burn their secrets, but the secrets would burn back. Chapter 11. Resistance in Hell. Prisoner uprisings and secret photos. Night at Birkenau was darker than ordinary night. There were no stars, no moon, no silence. Even when the camp quieted, the chimneys still glowed faintly, casting a dull orange haze over the sky, as though the ground itself was burning. But somewhere inside that glowing darkness, something had started to change. Not loudly, not openly, but quietly, in whispers. Words passed in breadcrumbs, messages hidden in old boots, plans buried beneath baroque floors. In Birkenau, where everything died, something refused to. Hope. It did not come like a torch or like a speech. It came like a fading heartbeat, pulsing weakly, refusing to stop. The Sonderkommando, who had seen the worst of Birkenau, who handled death in their hands, began to plan something almost impossible. To resist, not to escape, not even to survive, but to fight back, even if only once, even if only to prove they existed. It began with a photograph. Some Sonderkommando members had smuggled a small camera into the crematoria area, an old 35mm twin-lens camera. Risking death, they waited for the moment when guards were at lunch, then took it out. They aimed through cracks between planks, through open pit areas. They took pictures not of the buildings, but of what the buildings were doing. One photograph showed naked women being driven toward the gas chambers at Crematorium V. Another showed men dragging corpses toward burning pits. Another captured flames leaping from a trench so bright it stained the entire frame white. It was not art. It was proof. Proof that hell was not imagined. It was engineered. The Sonderkommando wrapped the film in a piece of cloth, sealed it in a small jar, and buried it near the crematorium. A message was scratched onto the jar. These are the real traces of our existence. Let them reach the world. That was the beginning. If photographs could escape, maybe something else could too. The idea of revolt grew, not as a thought of victory, but as a refusal to die without a trace. They knew the end was coming. They saw signals everywhere. The SS were destroying documents. Administrative offices burned papers by the ton. Blueprints of the crematoria vanished overnight. They began demolishing old records. Rumors spread that the crematoria themselves would soon be destroyed. One guard even whispered, "The Red Army is near." That was when the Sonderkommando made their decision. They would destroy the crematorium. Not all of them. They didn't dream that big. They only wanted one. Even if only to say, "We did not die quietly." But how do you revolt in hell? It began with women. Women working in a Union munitions factory inside Auschwitz, particularly Rosa Roboda, Esther Wajblom, Regina Safferstage, and Alla Gertner, began smuggling small amounts of gunpowder from the factory. Each day, they hid powder in hems, under fingernails, in tiny cloth pouches. They passed it to girls working in Canada. Then it reached the Sonderkommando, grain by grain. That powder was mixed with scrap metal, filled into small bottles, crude bombs. Not enough to win a war, but maybe enough to blow a door. By October 1944, they had enough. Enough to try. The Sonderkommando did not want to live. They wanted their death to speak. On the morning of October 7th, 1944, smoke drifted slowly above Crematorium 4. But this was not the usual smoke. It was darker. This time, it came from fire set by human hands, not machines. The revolt began just after noon. A shout, a signal, a hammer strike. Sonderkommando workers at crematorium, 4 hit guards with stones, shovels, picks. Others threw makeshift firebombs, igniting roofing and wooden structures. Gas chambers caught fire. Flames snapped across tar-coated roofs. SS guards ran in panic. Prisoners broke open storage sheds, grabbed axes, iron bars, knives. For minutes, just minutes, Birkenau felt human again. Dust flew. Fences shook. Flames rose. A Sonderkommando prisoner yelled, "We are humans, not numbers." Then gunfire erupted. SS reinforcements arrived, rifles blazing, machine guns ripping the air. Dogs charged. Men fell. The revolt collapsed. Flames burned fast, but bullets were faster. Some Sonderkommando tried to flee toward the woods. Most fell within meters. Not from fear, from bullets, from the inevitability of Birkenau. For a moment, the fire roared loud. Then it fell to smoke. Crematorium 4 burned. It collapsed from within. Its roof caved. Its walls cracked. It was no longer usable. The Nazis would never operate again. It had been crippled, not by bombs, but by human will. 700 prisoners took part in the uprising. 200 were gunned down immediately. The rest were hunted, tortured, executed over the next 48 hours. But before they died, they said something to the SS officers who interrogated them. "You will not erase everything." And by burning that building, they were right. The SS panicked. They accelerated their destruction efforts. They began dismantling Crematorium II and III. In late 1844, they removed the gas chamber doors, destroyed ventilation pipes, dynamited sections of the walls. They bulldozed mass graves, poured soil over pits, planted grass to hide the ash. They poisoned ponds where ashes had been dumped. The SS had built the machinery of death with pride. But now, they tried to erase it in shame. That was when the Sonderkommando, though still alive, started burying more notes, more diaries, more confessions. They wrote on scraps of cement bags, torn fabric, even pieces of bark. They described the gas chambers, the flames, the deception. They wrote what they had seen. They begged for someone to find it. One note read, "I am not afraid of dying. I am afraid of being forgotten." Another said, "All that will remain is smoke." But smoke can speak. They buried those words at the foundations of the crematoria. They placed them deep, under frost and mud, beneath the place where the flames used to roar. Years later, when archaeologists dug up the ruins of Birkenau, They found them. In rusted tins. Wrapped in cloth. Still legible. Still alive. Not all resistance was large. Not all resistance had fire. Some resistance took the form of defiance. In September 1944, an SS doctor mocked a group of Jews awaiting gassing, saying, "You will die like sheep." One prisoner looked at him calmly and replied, "We will die like humans. You will live like monsters." That single sentence would later be quoted at the Nuremberg trials. There were other acts too. A priest held secret mass in Block 26. A rabbi whispered Kaddish inside a barack, using ashes as ink to write prayers on fabric. A group of women in Canada stole baby shoes from a pile and hid them in their aprons, not to keep them, but so that one day someone would find them and no children had died here. A doctor treated typhus patients even after they had been abandoned by the SS. A musician played Beethoven on a broken violin in front of a barack. A mother, once a painter, traced her child's face in the frost of a wooden wall. These were not uprisings. They were proofs that Birkenau could not kill everything. By autumn 1944, Birkenau was changing. The flames died down. The transports slowed. Selections happened less often. The SS began to pack documents, burn archives, dismantle structures. The crematoria trembled, not with life, but with destruction. Birkenau was dying. But in that death, something else was being born. Testimony. Memory. Truth. The Sonderkommando knew it was almost over. Not victory. Not survival. But truth. One prisoner wrote on the final buried note, "We will not live to see it. But someone will. Someone will hear what the ashes are trying to say." As the SS blew up Crematoria II, III, and V in January 1945, their foundations cracked, but their secrets did not die. They had already escaped, in photographs, in diaries, in scattered human memories, in the nightmares of the men who built them, in the whispers of those who survived. Some witnesses lived. Many did not. But the ashes remained, and ashes do not lie. Resistance at Birkenau did not look like victory. It looked like truth refusing to burn. The Sonderkommando died, but their message did not. The crematoria crumbled, but their smoke still speaks. And as Soviet troops approached the gates, Birkenau trembled, not with fire, but with history. History, finally, trying to breathe. And now, with the crematoria collapsing into ruins, one last question began to rise, one that would confront the future. How do you liberate a place built for erasure? The answer was only days away, because soon, boots would cross the frozen Polish fields. Not German boots, but boots of the Red Army. And Birkenau, the silent heart of genocide, would finally be seen. Chapter 12. The Fall of the Machinery of Death. Crematoria shut down. The last winter of Birkenau did not arrive gently. It came like a warning. The winds were colder. The ground was harder. The chimneys smoked less. And the soldiers, who once walked with certainty, now walked with doubt. Something had changed. Rumors drifted through the camp faster than the snowflakes. The Russians are coming. The Red Army is near. Auschwitz will fall. But what would that mean? Freedom? Or the final execution of everyone left inside? The machinery of death began to slow not because of mercy, but because of fear. The SS did not worry about judgment or morality. They worried about evidence. Evidence that would prove what they had built here, what they had burned here, what they had destroyed here. If the world discovered the truth of Birkenau, not just the deaths, but the design, the precision, the industrial intent, then history would never forgive them. So they began to erase it. The SS did not gather people first. They gathered papers. They burned reports, lists, transport logs, Zyklon B orders, architectural blueprints. They burned names. They burned numbers. They burned signatures. They burned evidence that anyone had ever died here. Paper turned to ash, and ash settled onto the same ground already thick with the ashes of people. The Sonderkommando watched. They had seen corpses burn, but now they saw truth burn. The crematoria still functioned, but barely. Crematorium II's chimney coughed gray smoke. 3 groaned and rattled. for had been destroyed in the revolt. V smoldered weakly. The mountains of human ash that once filled pits, ponds, and roadsides began to thin. Not because death had stopped, but because there were fewer transports now. The last major Jewish population, Hungarian Jews, had already been exterminated. There were no more large ghettos to empty. The machine had consumed almost everything it had been designed to consume. The SS began preparing for something they called evacuierung, evacuation. But it was not truly evacuation. It was extermination by distance, a plan to move prisoners deeper into Germany so they would not be liberated. They would be marched away in winter, without food or shoes, until they collapsed. The SS did not need gas chambers for this. Coal would do the job. Snow would do the job. Hunger and exhaustion would do the job. Nature itself would finish their work. In December 1944, the destruction of Crematoria II and III began. It was an organized demolition. They removed steel doors, pipes, ventilation systems, and burn logs that had once held death behind sealed walls. They tore out bricks, smashed tiles, broke floor slabs. They used explosives to collapse roofs over what had been gas chambers. The rooms that once held thousands of screams were turned into rubble. But rubble can still speak, and rubble can still remember. Sonderkommando prisoners secretly sketched everything they saw being destroyed. They drew diagrams of gas chamber interiors, the positions of pillars, the layout of undressing rooms, even the thickness of walls. They drew because they knew something the SS did not fully understand. You can destroy a building, but not the truth of what the building was. Those drawings would survive. The crematoria would not. On January 20th, 1945, an order came from Berlin. Complete destruction of Auschwitz-Birkenau must be carried out before enemy arrival. This time, not just documents, not just structures, people. The SS no longer had time for full selections, no time to process prisoners. So they selected with one rule: those who could walk would walk. Those who could not walk would die. Birkenau began to empty, but not slowly, not quietly. The forced evacuations began at dawn on January 18, 1945. It was cold, -15°C. Snow fell. Prisoners were ordered to line up, 30,000 of them. Striped uniforms, wooden clogs, starved, sick, fevered, trembling. Some without coats, some without blankets, some without hope. They were told they would be moved to a new camp. They were told they would get food on the way. They were not told the truth. They would walk, and walk, and walk, until they collapsed. And if they collapsed, they would be shot, or left to freeze, or buried by snow. It was not an evacuation. It was the beginning of the death marches. Columns of prisoners stretched for kilometers, a silent parade of skeletons stumbling through icy roads. They left Birkenau, but Birkenau did not leave them. Its hunger, its exhaustion, its silence followed them. They walked past villages, past fields, past churches. Some villagers watched from windows. Some wept. Some turned away. Some pretended not to see. Along the roads lay bodies. Some were curled in the snow, as if sleeping. Some were face down. Some sat frozen upright, their arms still wrapped around their knees. No one buried them. Snow did. Meanwhile, inside Birkenau, death did not march. It waited. 6,000 prisoners were left behind, too weak to move. They remained in freezing barracks with no guards, no food, no fire. Some were sick beyond recognition. Some whispered prayers. Some simply lay still, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something they could not name. The SS rushed now. They blew up warehouses, guard stations, offices, sanitation blocks. They burned down Canada, the storage area where mountains of belongings were piled. They destroyed records, but not all. They dynamited Crematorium V, the last standing engine of death. But even when destroyed, it still looked like what it had been. It still smelled like what it had done. One SS officer walked through the ruins of Crematorium II and said softly, "We build it to kill. Now we kill to hide." Another officer replied, "You cannot hide smoke." He was right. The buildings were crumbling, but the air still remembered. Finally, on January 26, 1945, the last SS guards fled Birkenau. They left in trucks and on foot, carrying their rifles, their dogs, their silence. They left behind piles of shoes, piles of suitcases, piles of human hair. They left behind almost no living witnesses. Almost. Morning broke on January 27, 1945, slowly and without joy. That was the day Soviet soldiers entered Auschwitz. But they did not storm it. They did not fight. They walked through open gates. No shots fired. No guards. They saw barracks, fences, watchtowers, but no enemy. Just silence. Just shadows. Then they saw movement. Not a march. Not an attack. Just slow, human movement. People in striped uniforms. Some standing. Some crawling. Some sitting against walls like broken statues. Their faces hollow. Eyes empty. Some did not look like they were alive. Others were alive, but did not know it. Soviet soldiers did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They did not take pictures posing by gates. They stopped. They looked. And they understood. Auschwitz was not a camp. It was something else. It was a crime scene. They began removing the final prisoners, 6,000 survivors from Birkenau, Auschwitz-I, Monowitz, and the subcamps. They carried them on stretchers. They wrapped them in blankets. They gave them bread. Not too much, because too much bread could kill someone who had starved too long. They gave them water, slowly. They spoke gently. They didn't ask questions. They knew the answers would hurt. In Crematorium II's ruins, Red Army doctors found partially destroyed records. They found shattered Zyklon B canisters. They found burned structural plans. And they found bones, buried in pits, scattered by frost, sticking through the earth like pale fingers pointing at the sky. In Canada warehouses, they found the belongings of those who had died. 38,000 pairs of men's shoes. 43,000 pairs of women's shoes. Millions of children's shoes. Matching sizes. Matching types. Matching socks stuffed inside them. Some had small names written inside. Some had flowers painted on their sides. But there were no small children. In other rooms, they found more. 7 tons of human hair, bundled in sacks. Still braided. Still curled. Still trapped in memory. They had found the truth. Even with the buildings destroyed. Even with the documents burned. The truth remained. Because the chimneys were gone. But the ashes were everywhere. Those Soviet soldiers did not free Birkenau. They revealed it. They uncovered its remains. Its ruins. Its scars. Its testimony. In the weeks that followed, doctors and investigators documented everything. Photographed everything. Every brick. Every stretcher. Every bone. Every burned foundation. Every scrap of cloth. They did not understand everything. But they understood enough. Auschwitz had not just been a camp. It had been a factory. And its smoke had already reached the world. And so, the machinery of death was dismantled. Not with force, but with truth. The crematoria fell silent. The gas chambers crumbled. The ramps grew weeds. But the story did not end. Because now, something else would begin. Not death. Not silence. But memory. And memory does not need buildings. It does not need witnesses. It does not even need words. It lives in the air. And the air above Birkenau still remembers. But liberation was not the end. It was only the beginning of the world asking, now that we know, what do we do? Chapter 13. The death marches begin. Escape through frozen hell. Winter did not arrive in Birkenau, like in other places. It did not bring stillness, or peace, or white-covered fields. It brought motion. Desperate, frantic, forced motion. It brought footsteps, thousands of them. It brought boots and clogs, bare feet and frostbitten skin, dragging through snow, leaving trails of blood on the frozen roads of Poland. It brought what the Nazis called evacuation, but what prisoners soon called something more truthful. The Death March. It began on January 18, 1945. Without warning. Without explanation. Without mercy. Prisoners were shaken awake before dawn. Orders were shouted through barracks. Everyone out. Everyone stand. Pack your belongings. Those who could stand, stood. Those who could not, were beaten until they did. Those who still could not stayed behind, left for something unknown, something worse or better. No one could tell. They were told they were being moved to another camp, to safer ground, away from the advancing Red Army, to camps in Germany where conditions would be better. It was all lies. The Nazis did not plan to relocate prisoners for survival. They planned to move them to die elsewhere, because Birkenau could no longer hide its crimes. The roads were covered in snow, hard-packed like glass. The wind was sharp, slicing through striped uniforms, through thin blankets, through starving bodies. Prisoners were given no food, no shoes, no water. Some wrapped their feet in rags. Some had no feet left to wrap. Some had no strength to walk. But they walked anyway, because if they didn't walk, they were shot. They marched, and marched, and marched. Columns stretched for kilometers. People in striped uniforms, hunched and shaking, trudging toward an unknown direction. SS guards walked along the sides, rifles ready. Dogs barked constantly. Their breath froze in air. Prisoners' breath came slower, weaker, until it disappeared entirely. They moved through the villages of southern Poland, through frozen fields, through forests that looked black against white snow, through towns where people watched from windows. Some villagers pitied them. Some looked away. Some offered their children crumbs of bread to throw secretly onto the road. SS guards kicked them for it, but the bread was thrown anyway. Some prisoners caught that bread. Some did not. One man reached for it, only for his hands to tremble and miss. He collapsed in the snow. A guard did not shoot him. He did not have to. The cold did instead. The sick, the weak, and the old began to fall behind. They were told to walk faster. They could not. They were shot. Their bodies lay in the road, not covered, not buried, just left as frozen warnings. Some prisoners tried to speak, tried to encourage each other, tried to remind themselves they were human, but words froze in their throats. They were too tired to speak, too hungry to remember language. They did speak with other things, though, with looks, with gestures, with hands reaching out to steady strangers they had never met before, with fingers holding on to fingers when nothing else remained. Night brought no rest. Prisoners were stuffed into barns, cattle sheds, factories, abandoned schools, packed so tightly they could not lie down. Some died standing up. Some died sitting against cold walls. Some died quietly in sleep, and no one noticed until morning. Death on the march was not sudden. It came slowly. Numbness in fingers, numbness in thoughts, numbness everywhere. Then silence. Yet they marched. The guards grew nervous too. They heard artillery in the distance. They saw planes overhead. They knew the war was turning. Some became more brutal, others more careless. None of them showed compassion. Compassion did not survive on this road. The route changed. Some columns went west, toward Władysław. Others toward Gliwice. Some turned south toward Czechoslovakia. One group went nearly 600 kilometers to Gunskirchen in Austria. In the end, more than 60,000 prisoners were forced onto death marches from Auschwitz. At least 15,000 died on the road. But numbers do not describe the march. Images do. A pair of feet wrapped in paper and frozen to the road, stiff as wood. A child, too weak to cry, being carried by a stranger until the stranger fell. The child cried then. A girl, who once sang lullabies in Birkenau, now whispering them through cracked lips to dying women in a barn. They closed their eyes while she sang. An old man, who once had a family, now walking alone, whispering names into the wind. No one answered. Some reached their destination, if it could be called that. German camps like Buchenwald, Mauthausen, Ravensbrück, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau. Some of these places did not have gas chambers. But they had death. They had starvation. They had exhaustion. Many died within days of arrival. The prisoners who survived were not alive because they were strong. They survived because chance allowed it, because their boots held a little longer, because they fell at the right time, or because someone gave them a hand, one time too many. One survivor later said, "I survived because I walked, not because I wanted to, but because there was only walking or dying." Another said, "What I remember most is not death. It is how we kept each other alive, even when we were already dead. Back in Birkenau, only a few remained. Too sick to march, too weak to be useful, too close to death to matter. They were left behind, without guards, without food, without answers. The silence was terrifying. They waited. Days passed. They wondered if the SS would come back, to finish them, or save them. They didn't know which would be worse. Then, on January 27th, 1945, they heard something. Not boots, not dogs, not shouts. Engines. The sound of tanks. The sound of liberation. The Red Army entered Birkenau not with fanfare, but with caution. They expected resistance. They expected a fight. Instead, they found silence. A dead camp. A cold camp. A camp still covered in footprints, but not the living kind. They found skeletal people in bunks, barely alive. They found children hiding in barracks, waiting for mothers who would never come. They found clothes, shoes, hair, tons of hair. They found suitcases full of names, but no owners. They found the ruins of crematoria and their broken foundations. They found bone fragments sticking through the frost like white grass. They found the ash. But most hauntingly, they found the silence. One Soviet soldier later said, "I had seen death before, but never after." Birkenau was not a camp anymore. It was a cemetery without graves. But the story did not end there. Because the march did not just lead west through snow and hunger. It led forward, through decades, into courtrooms, into memorials, into history. Those who survived would tell what happened. They would speak not just of gas chambers and selections, but of the march, the cold, the hunger, the steps taken not toward life, but away from erasure. Because Birkenau did not end with fire. It ended with footsteps. Footsteps of dying people who refused to vanish quietly. History often records wars through victories and conquests. But the death marches were not about victory. They were about endurance. About what it means to walk when there is no reason to walk. To hope when hope has already died. To remember when memory itself hurts. The death marches were not just the end of Birkenau. They were its echo. And echoes do not disappear quickly. They travel. They linger. They whisper. So that when someone asks, how did they die? The world can answer. They didn't just die. They walked. And the world watched. Chapter 14. Liberation and Shock. First glimpse into hell. The gates were open, but there was no celebration. No cheering. No flags waving. No triumphant music. Freedom did not arrive in Birkenau with fanfare. It arrived quietly, like a hesitant step into a dark room, unsure what it would find. It arrived on a winter morning, January 27th, 1945, when soldiers of the Soviet Red Army approached the camp expecting resistance, sabotage, even traps. Instead, they found stillness. Smoke still drifted from places where buildings had burned, but the chimneys that had once breathed death stood silent. Watchtowers were empty. Barbed wire fences rattled softly in the wind. The Nazis were gone, but the camp was not empty. Survivors did not rush to greet them. They did not run. They did not cry. They simply looked. Some from inside barracks. Some standing weakly in the snow. Some too fragile to lift their heads. They did not understand. Not at first. They did not believe. How could they? Some had been in Birkenau for years and had seen death so often that life no longer looked real. So they watched the soldiers with hollow eyes, unsure if they were dreaming or hallucinating or already dead. A Soviet medic stepped toward a woman wrapped in rags. She didn't move away, but she didn't move closer either. She only whispered, in Polish, "Are you angels?" He could not answer. They wandered deeper inside the camp, stepping over broken fences, bundles of abandoned blankets, and footprints that no longer looked alive. The air smelled strange, not quite smoke, not quite rot, not quite earth. It was colder than outside the gates, as if the ground itself was grieving. Inside the barracks, they found the living, if they could still be called that. Men and women lay on wooden planks, their bodies skeletal, their faces stretched tight over bones like cracked porcelain. Some had blankets. Others had nothing. Their clothes were thin, soaked, stiff with sweat and dirt. Many could not stand. Some could not speak. Their lips were dry, eyes sunken. Some looked at the soldiers with faint recognition. Others stared past them, into a place memory could not return from. One child, no more than 7, sat on the floor beside a woman who had died days earlier. He did not cry. He simply held her hand. He thought she was sleeping. Doctors and medics moved through the barracks with urgency, trying to help, but most survivors were too weak to walk. Some had typhus. Some had dysentery. Some had tuberculosis. Some had no diagnosis except one: starvation. A Russian nurse tried to lift a young woman onto a stretcher. Her body felt weightless. The nurse thought she was unconscious, but the woman opened her eyes and whispered, "Please don't take my shoes." She had no shoes, only cloth wrapped around her feet. In some barracks, they found bodies, frozen in bunks, arms wrapped around knees, faces pressed into straw. It was hard to tell who had died hours ago, days ago, or weeks ago. Some lay beside the living. The living did not push them away. The living did not ask for them to be removed. They had grown used to sharing space with the dead. The soldiers found stores of clothing, mountains of suitcases, shoes, coats, children's toys. They found piles of eyeglasses, tens of thousands of pairs. They found hair, bundled, braided, tied, collected, more than 7,000 kilograms of cut human hair. They found rooms full of prosthetic limbs, rooms full of baby clothes. They found teeth. They found gold. They found ashes. Then there were the rooms that made no sense. Rooms full of pots and pans. Rooms full of prayer books. Rooms full of wedding rings. Rooms full of dolls. A warehouse with nothing but empty suitcases, each with a name and address carefully written on the tag. Thousands and thousands of names. But there were no people. One soldier stepped into a warehouse and whispered, "How many lived here?" Another answered, "None lived here, but they all died here." They approached the ruins of Crematorium II. Half collapsed, roof gone, walls cracked, but the smell remained. The ground around it was wet, not from rain, not from thawing snow. It was from ash, layer upon layer of ash, human ash. The soldiers knelt down and picked up handfuls of soil. It was gray. It was mixed with bone fragments. It crumbled like dust. One soldier asked, "Is this the earth here?" Another replied, "No, this is people." Soviet photographers took pictures. Thousands of them. They photographed the survivors in the barracks. The children in striped uniforms. The piles of shoes. The wire fences. The entrance gate with the sign that no longer mocked them. Arbeit mocked free. They photographed the living. They photographed the dead. They photographed the silence. But the cameras could not capture the smell, or the hollow sound of wind moving through empty watchtowers, or the sound of survivors whispering to one another. Not full sentences, just fragments of names, places, prayers. The Soviet soldiers did not cheer. They did not celebrate victory. They had fought fierce battles across Eastern Europe. They had seen burned villages, bombed cities, and thousands dead. But they had not seen this. Not in any war. Not on any battlefield. This was not destruction. This was erasure. One soldier wrote in his diary, "The war made me believe humans could be cruel. Auschwitz made me wonder if humans were human at all." They stayed. Not for a day, but for weeks. Medical teams set up makeshift hospitals. They washed survivors with warm water, even when their skin peeled like parchment. They brought black bread, but only a little, knowing too much would kill them. They spoke softly, even when language failed. They listened to stories. They documented what they could, but they could not understand it all. No human mind could. Slowly, some survivors began to speak. They told stories of trains, of selections, of numbers, of gas, of fire, of ashes that fell like snow. They did not cry while speaking. They had cried too much before, but the soldiers listening did. One survivor, a young man from Hungary, pointed to the chimney and said, "That is where my mother died." Then he pointed to the ground and said, "That is where she still lives." Some survivors asked where they would go now. Home. But what was home? Their families were gone. Their towns were gone. Their names were gone. Some had no memories left of life before the camp. Some did not remember their own faces. A Soviet photographer took a picture of a young girl wearing a striped uniform. Her eyes stared directly at the camera. Calm. Hollow. She did not smile. She did not blink. That photograph would later become one of the most recognized images of the Holocaust. But in that moment, it was not history. It was just a face. Birkenau was liberated. But liberation did not cure the camp. It did not silence its echoes. It did not erase its scars. In the weeks that followed, the camp began to empty, not through death now, but through rescue. Trucks took the weakest to hospitals in Krakow and Katowice. Some would live, some would not. Some died only days after liberation, not from gas, not from bullets, but from the long, slow damage that Birkenau had already done. Survivors did not leave together. They walked out in small groups. Some walked past the Crematoria ruins and stopped for a while. Not to mourn, not to pray, just to look, as if trying to make sure it was real, that the walls were broken, that the chimneys were cold. Some took pebbles from the ground. Some took handfuls of soil. Some took nothing. One survivor, on leaving the camp, stopped by the wire fence and placed her hand on it one last time. "This held me for so long," she said. "I do not know how to walk without it." After they left, the wind blew through the barracks. The mud froze. The chimneys stood silent. The snow fell as it always did. And Birkenau became something new. Not a factory, not a prison, not even a cemetery. It became a scar on history, a scar on humanity, a scar that does not heal, but warns. Because liberation did not really free Birkenau. It revealed it. And from that moment on, the world could no longer say, "We did not know." Birkenau stood silent, but not speechless. It was waiting not for justice, not for vengeance, but for memory. Because the dead do not ask for tears. They ask for witness. And Birkenau will forever remain that witness. And yet, even after liberation, one question remained. Not for the survivors, but for us. Now that we know what happened here, what do we do with that knowledge? That answer begins in the final chapter. Chapter 15, Echoes of Birkenau, Memory, Justice, and the World That Watched. History does not end when the gates open. It does not end when the smoke clears or when soldiers arrive with stretchers and bread. History does not end when the last prisoner leaves Birkenau. In some ways, that is when it begins. For what Birkenau left behind was not just ruins, not just ash, not just photographs. It left a question that still stares at the world, still waits for its answer. What do we do with such knowledge? And what do we do now that we cannot pretend we did not see? When the Red Army liberated Birkenau on January 27th, 1945, they did not arrive to applause. There was no victory parade. There were no flags. Because there was no victory here. Only evidence. Evidence that humans could be turned into numbers. Numbers could be turned into ash. And ash could be buried without a grave, without a prayer, without a name. Liberation did not erase Birkenau. It revealed it. And revelation hurts. The Soviets took photographs, collected testimonies, wrote reports, not with triumph, but with disbelief. They recorded piles of shoes, mountains of hair, prayer shawls, baby pacifiers, dolls, wedding rings, dentures, eyeglasses. They saw warehouses of belongings, but almost no people. They walked through rooms meant to hold bodies, but built to erase identities. They saw the chambers where people walked in as families and left without names, without forms, without even bodies. They saw the crematoria, broken and burned, with only concrete slabs left where death once had an address. The world would later visit those ruins. Journalists, doctors, lawyers, soldiers, survivors. Some knelt down and ran their fingers through the soil. They expected dirt. They found ash. They expected stones. They found bones. Reporters asked the few living survivors what had happened here. Many survivors answered with silence. Not because they did not know, but because words seemed too weak to describe what was done with precision, planning, diagrams, and timetables. Genocide had not been improvisation. It had been architecture. Auschwitz-Birkenau did not disappear into history. It entered courtrooms. In Nuremberg, photographs of those warehouses full of shoes and belongings were displayed on massive screens. Lawyers quoted names of SS doctors, architects, camp commanders. Documents were read aloud. Orders for Zyklon B, transport lists, selections, execution schedules. And slowly, carefully, the world began to see that Auschwitz was not only the product of cruelty, it was also the product of calculation. A genocide built not from madness, but from engineering, law, logistics, medicine, and obedient paperwork. At the trials, Nazi officers were asked, "Did you know what was happening?" Some said no. Others said they were only following orders. But some, in their final moments before sentencing, whispered what history would remember most. "We did not think the world would care." After the trials, the world stood before a mirror. Governments asked themselves what they had known. Journalists asked why they had not investigated deeper. Neighbors asked why they had not knocked on certain doors. Churches asked why their hymns had drowned out the sounds of trains. The world realized that silence was not just absence. Silence was participation. But justice was not complete, because justice could not bring back children whose faces were never photographed. Justice could not name every person whose suitcase lay buried in Canada warehouses. Justice could not crawl into the piles of human hair and find the lives those strands once belonged to. Justice could not reverse the death marches. It could not rebuild families. It could not fill the empty chairs that sat at dinner tables in Krakow, Vienna, Budapest, and Paris. Justice could not sing the songs lost in the gypsy camp. Justice could only listen. Listen to the voices of those who survived, if it chose to. The first survivors began telling their stories not to crowds, but to one person at a time. In refugee shelters, in small apartments, in hospitals, often to strangers who didn't know what to say. A survivor would speak of standing on the ramp while her mother was sent to the left and she was sent to the right. Another would speak of watching a guard hold a baby by the leg and ask, "Should I throw it in alive or dead?" Another would speak of carrying bodies from gas chambers and how some bodies were still warm. Words broke like glass in their mouths, but they spoke, because silence was the last weapon of Birkenau, and they refused to let Birkenau win. Some survivors never spoke, not even once. They carried silence like an invisible second skin. They could not find words to explain how humanity had been dismantled. They could not find words to explain why they were still alive when so many others were not. They could not explain how human voices could still sound human after hearing so many screams. The world began teaching the Holocaust. In books, in classrooms, in documentaries, in museums. But something seemed always missing. Because to teach Birkenau, you cannot simply recite numbers. 1.1 million dead. You cannot simply show photos of bones and barbed wire. You must explain how it happened. You must explain that it did not begin with gas chambers. It began with words, with laws, with whispers, with looks, with people who said, "They're not like us." It began when neighbors looked away, when clerks stamped papers, when doctors measured skulls, when engineers drafted blueprints, when pastors refused to speak, when trains departed in silence. Birkenau did not begin at Birkenau. It began in living rooms, in newspapers, in parliaments, in silence. And so, memorials began to appear. At first, simple stones, then plaques, then full museums, then journals, diaries, poetry, first-person testimonies. Schoolchildren visited former camps in Poland, Germany, Austria, France, the Czech Republic. They saw barracks. They saw fences. They took pictures. But photographs cannot carry the smell of fear. Photographs cannot hold the sound of empty wind echoing through abandoned chimneys. Photographs cannot reveal how cold the air feels when standing in a place where children once waited for their mothers to return. Birkenau today stands quiet, but that quiet is not peace. It is echo. The gates remain. The rail tracks remain. Some barracks remain, though frail, like aging bones. The chimneys remain. Even when broken, they remain. Grass grows where ashes once lay. Snow falls gently where fire once roared. But the ground remembers. And so do we. Or at least, we try. Every year, survivors return. Some arrive alone. Some with children. Some with grandchildren. They stand quietly. They do not point at buildings. They look at fences, at chimneys, at the sky. They look at the ground, and sometimes they kneel. They never stay long. One elderly survivor once said, "I do not come here to remember. I come here to keep the world from forgetting." A young student asked him, "Does it hurt to be here?" He answered, "It would hurt more if no one was." Time did not end Birkenau. Time changed it. It turned it from a place of death into a place of warning. A warning that genocide is not born in fire. It is built in silence. To truly understand Birkenau, one must understand not just what happened, but how it became possible. Not just how humans died, but how humanity was dismantled. Gas chambers did not begin killing until words had already killed. Many ask, how could people do this? But perhaps the more urgent question is, how could so many people let it happen? That is the question Birkenau whispers now. Every day, to every visitor, to every historian, to every child walking through the gates. It whispers, do not just mourn me, understand me. For Birkenau is not a story about the past. It is a map showing how quickly ordinary life can become extraordinary cruelty. A map showing how little it takes for a normal village, with farmers and teachers and rail workers, to become the edge of hell. The chimneys are cold now, the gas chamber shattered, the ashes buried, the ramp empty, but the memory remains, not as a wound, but as a warning that if hatred is not challenged, if silence is not broken, if small injustices are not stopped, then barbed wire will return. Then Birkenau will not be the last. The world once said, never again. But Birkenau does not believe in slogans. It believes only in watchfulness. For Birkenau is not only in Poland. It is wherever humanity is forgotten. Not just where people are killed, but wherever they are dehumanized, wherever they are erased, wherever they are seen not as human, but as numbers. That is why we must tell the story. Not once, not with tears, but forever. Because memory is not a candle. It is a fire. And as long as we keep it burning, Birkenau will never return. And perhaps one day, it will no longer be an echo, but a lesson.